Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 19th meeting of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now continue the interactive dialogue on the oral update of the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. We shall return to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. I now give the floor to Amnesty International.
Amnesty International thanks the Commission of Inquiry for its vital work since 2016. As the continuing grave violations it has documented demonstrate, a handful of symbolic gestures cannot compensate for the deeper, more durable reforms required to meaningfully improve the human rights situation in Burundi. We warmly welcome the release of human rights defender Germain Rukuki in June. However, in the same month, lawyer Tony Germain Nkina was convicted on trumped-up charges in all likelihood because of his previous human rights work, a chilling reminder of the risks facing even those no longer actively involved in civil society. While space to speak out remains severely limited inside Burundi, the government has also sought to repress the work of HRDs and journalists in exile. Last month, President Ndayishimiye launched a personal attack against journalist Esdras Ndikumana for his reporting on the impact of COVID-19 in the country, accusing him of hating the country in which he was raised. Similarly, both the President and the Prosecutor General of the Republic have dismissed and minimized reports of enforced disappearances, despite credible investigations by NGOs, and as the Commission has noted, more than 250 open cases before the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. The government refuses to acknowledge the scale of the human rights challenges facing the country or to meaningfully cooperate with this Council and its mechanisms. We urge the Council to keep in place monitoring and reporting of the level that has been provided by the Commission of Inquiry. Thank you, Madam President.
The next speaker on the list is the International Service for Human Rights.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Chers membres de la commission d'enquête, nous vous remercions pour les conclusions de votre rapport. Nous déplorons que la situation des droits humains au Burundi reste très préoccupante plus d'une année après l'élection du président Evariste Ndayishimiye et la mise en place de son gouvernement. Plusieurs atteintes au droit à la vie, dont des centaines de meurtres et plusieurs dizaines de cas d'enlèvement et de disparition forcée ont été enregistrés depuis l'avènement du nouveau régime, mais au lieu de mener des enquêtes crédibles, les autorités burundaises gardent le silence sur ces atrocités et nient l'existence des cas de disparition forcée. Nous sommes préoccupés par la complaisance et l'absence d'indépendance de la Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme qui, en dépit de la récente reconquête du statut A, a affirmé dans son dernier rapport qu'elle n'avait eu connaissance d'aucun cas de disparition forcée en 2020, s'alignant ainsi sur le déni gouvernemental. Nous saluons la libération de Nestor Nibitanga et Germain Rukuki, mais rappelons que des centaines de journalistes et de défenseurs de droits humains sont toujours en exil, que plusieurs organisations de droits humains demeurent radiées et des radios indépendantes interdites. Nous rappelons également la condamnation à la prison à vie d'une douzaine de défenseurs de droits humains et de journalistes, ainsi que des opposants, suivant une procédure injuste et secrète. Nous réitérons notre soutien au travail de la commission d'enquête et demandons le renouvellement de son mandat. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
The next speaker is Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Thank you, Madam President. Civicus and independent Burundian civil society organizations welcome the work of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Burundi and its comprehensive report on the situation of human rights in the country, which provides critical oversight. We urge the UN Human Rights Council to ensure continued scrutiny of Burundi through the renewal of this mandate. There has been no improvement in the human rights situation in Burundi since the 2020 change in government. Civic space remains closed and with independent and critical voices, including civil society organizations and human rights defenders, targeted. Lawyer Tony Germain Nkina was sentenced to 5 years in prison as recently as June 2021. Several media outlets are still unable to operate due to restrictions. Many civil society activists and independent journalists remain in exile, while those in Burundi continue to face intimidation, detention, or trials on trumped-up charges. Armed clashes between members of the security forces, sometimes supported by Imbonerakure, and members of armed groups continue with increased attacks on civilians. In light of this, we reiterate our calls on the Council to renew the Commissions of Inquiry's mandate to ensure continued monitoring and documentation of the human rights situation. We call on the government of Burundi to fully implement the 2020 electoral presidential promises on improving human rights situation in the country. We thank you.
I now give the floor to Mizan Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, President. We would like to thank the Commission of Inquiry for its latest report establishing the facts about the situation of human rights in Burundi. We welcome the progress made by the Burundian government, particularly in the fight against impunity and corruption and the promotion of the rule of law. Still, important steps need to be taken to advance national reconciliation, respect fundamental freedoms, preserve democratic space, and protect human rights. Mizan Center for Human Rights and the Geneva International Center for Justice are deeply concerned about the numerous violations that continue to be perpetrated in the country, in particular the cases of torture, enforced disappearances, and arbitrary detention faced by political opponents, human rights defenders, and journalists. We encourage Burundi to continue increasing its effort in recognizing and investigating all human rights violations committed and hold perpetrators accountable. Only by doing so, Burundi can move toward peace, stability, and development. It is regrettable to hear the continued refusal of Burundi to collaborate with international human rights bodies and the Commission of Inquiry. Therefore, we urge all parties to resume progressive cooperation and Burundi to assume responsibility for the human rights violations reported in the country and to make the required structural changes. To the Commission of Inquiry, what steps can the international community take to build solidarity with the government of Burundi and all other parties involved to help them in achieving long-lasting peace? Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the next speaker on the list, Advocates for Human Rights.
Madam President, the Advocates for Human Rights welcomes the report of the Commission of Inquiry on Burundi. Since April 2015, the human rights crisis in Burundi has escalated in both its extent and brutality. Reports of media restriction, voter suppression, and arbitrary arrests and beatings of opposition members during the recent 2020 elections show little change to the situation. These conditions have caused over 250,000 to flee this state-sponsored oppression and violence. As a provider of legal services to asylum seekers, the Advocates for Human Rights has represented victims of violence from Burundi and documented firsthand accounts of illegal invasions and searches of homes and businesses, including firing on civilians, looting of property, and the rape of a witness. The arbitrary arrest of an anti-corruption activist based on false charges, culminating in her assault and rape, and the targeting of supporters of constitutional election law, as well as journalists, involving arbitrary arrests followed by brutal torture for extended periods. These and other accounts of human rights abuses support our recommendations that the Human Rights Council continue the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Burundi and retain the situation in Burundi on its agenda under Item 4, request that the Security Council impose sanctions against individuals responsible for both systemic human rights violations as well as the obstruction of UN mechanisms to document violations, and encourage effective justice mechanisms to ensure that individuals responsible for these abuses are held accountable. Thank you.
And this was the last speaker on my list. I will now give the floor to members of the Commission of Inquiry for altogether 5 minutes to respond to comments and questions received. The first to speak will be Ms. Hampson on Zoom. You have the floor, Madam.
Monsieur le Vice-président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, nous avons reçu une question précise sur la Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme de Burundi. La commission d'enquête note les efforts de la SNHR pour adresser certains cas de torture et autres mauvais traitements. Mais elle constate qu'aucun cas cité dans le rapport de 2020 n'a une dimension politique. Il n'y a aucun cas de violation du droit à la vie, ni d'enlèvement, ni de disparition forcée. La commission d'enquête espère que la réaccréditation de la SNHR l'encouragera à démontrer dans sa pratique qu'elle est effectivement indépendante, notamment en s'occupant de tous les cas de violation, y compris les plus sensibles. Les autres questions se groupent autour du thème « Comment aider le Burundi à mettre en place les réformes structurelles nécessaires pour assurer la bonne gouvernance, la promotion d'un état de droit et un système judiciaire capable de protéger les droits de l'homme et le respect des droits de l'homme. La commission d'enquête souligne que le respect et la protection des droits de l'homme ont besoin d'un cadre de respect pour la loi et d'un système judiciaire indépendant et impartial. Il faut aussi que les autorités reconnaissent que la société civile n'existe pas uniquement pour les assister et appuyer les projets gouvernementaux. Tout cela demande des changements à la fois structurels et aussi dans l'esprit des autorités. Nos rapports, celui de cette année et les rapports précédents, identifient des recommandations précises à cet égard. Selon l'analyse basée sur les facteurs de risque, la communauté internationale a besoin de montrer son soutien des autorités burundaises tout en montrant une grande vigilance. Pour aider à la fois les autorités nationales et la communauté internationale, il est nécessaire d'avoir un mécanisme international sous l'égide de l'ONU qui permet de suivre de près et de manière objective et indépendante la situation au Burundi. Il ne faut surtout pas ni oublier le Burundi, ni abandonner les Burundais. Je passe la parole à Monsieur Diène pour terminer.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole à Monsieur Diène pour faire ses conclusions et commentaires.
Merci
Monsieur
beaucoup,
Diène.
Monsieur le Vice-président. Monsieur le Vice-président, la Commission d'abord remercie le Conseil des droits de l'homme et les États membres pour la confiance qui lui a été accordée et le renouvellement exceptionnel de son mandat pendant 5 ans. Cela signifie, que la situation au Burundi le mérite et qu'elle est profonde, mais que 2, que la Commission a fait un travail objectif et crédible. Et ce travail est dû d'abord à la qualité exceptionnelle de l'équipe du secrétariat que nous avons eue, mais aussi à l'engagement éthique des commissaires pour faire un travail objectif, crédible au service du peuple burundais. En conclusion, Monsieur le Président, quelle que soit la décision prise ou que va prendre le Conseil des droits de l'homme, les rapports de la Commission sont là. Et je pense que ces rapports, nous invitons tous les acteurs de la société burundaise et les acteurs internationaux à s'y reporter. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Je vous remercie et ceci nous amène à la fin de ce dialogue interactif. Je voudrais remercier M. Doudou Diène et Mme Françoise Hamson pour leur participation à ce dialogue. We will now take a short break before the interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Belarus. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue on the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Belarus, pursuant to Council Resolution 46/10. And it is my honor to welcome to the podium Ms. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It is my honor to give the floor to the High Commissioner for her presentation. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, colleagues. The Council has requested an oral update and interactive dialogue pursuant to Resolution 46/20, which requested me to carry out a comprehensive examination of alleged human rights violations committed in Belarus since the 1st of May 2020, with assistance from relevant experts and mandate holders. I appointed 3 international experts on the 14th of May 2021, Karina Moskalenko from the Russian Federation, Susan Basili from Canada, and Marko Milanovic from Serbia, to support this examination, and we are pleased to have them with us today. Regrettably, following the establishment of the office's examination of the situation in Belarus, the government informed us that they will not cooperate with the office to implement the resolution. The request for a meeting with the Belarus ambassador to discuss cooperation and access was rejected. This will unfortunately prevent the OHCHR examination from paying a working visit to the country, but we will instead undertake our work using standard OHCHR methodologies for examining situations remotely. The OHCHR examination team has also issued a call for submissions from all stakeholders, including victims and witnesses. We are currently completing the recruitment of the full secretariat of the office examination of the situation in Belarus. The interim period had been covered by a short-term start-up team composed of OHCHR staff engaged in initial collection and analysis of available information and dealing with administrative, human resources, financial, logistical, and information technology setup work. Mr. Vice President, our office considers that the human rights situation in Belarus has continued to worsen in 2021. I am deeply concerned by increasingly severe restrictions on civic space and fundamental freedoms, including continuing patterns of police raids against civil society organizations and independent media, and the arrest and criminal prosecutions of human rights activists and journalists on what routinely appears to be politically motivated charges. Over 650 individuals in Belarus are now believed to be imprisoned because of their opinions, among them members of the opposition, human rights defenders, journalists, protesters, and activists, including the chair of well-known human rights group Biasna. Media freedoms continue to be obstructed, and at least 497 journalists and media workers were reportedly detained in 2020, with at least 68 subjected to ill treatment. As of 10 August 2021, 27 journalists and media workers remained in detention, among them Raman Pratasevich, who was arrested in May following the extraordinary diversion of a flight from Greece to Lithuania. By the end of August 2021, 129 civil society organizations have been closed down or were in the process of liquidation by the authorities, including several long-standing partners of the UN Human Rights Mechanism. Independent news portals Tut.by and Cercalo.io have been termed extremist, making dissemination of any of their content subject to criminal prosecution. The Belarusian Penn Center was shut down by a Supreme Court ruling, followed by the Belarusian Association of Journalists, and the Ministry of Justice has also filed a lawsuit for the liquidation of the Belarusian Helsinki Committee. The scale and pattern of behavior by the Belarusian authorities to date strongly suggests that limitations to freedom of expression and assembly, among other human rights, are primarily aimed at suppressing criticism of and dissent from governmental policies, rather than any aim regarded as legitimate under human rights law, such as the protection of public order. Mr. Vice President, I am alarmed by persistent allegations of widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment in the context of arbitrary arrest and detention of protesters. We have no evidence to date of any genuine and impartial investigations have taken place into reports of incidents that took place during the dispersal of demonstrations in the days following 9 August 2020. During these incidents, hundreds of protesters were violently beaten by security officers, in particular by Riot police and special police forces. Many protesters, including children, were also subjected to ill treatment in detention, and at least 4 protesters died. Gender-based violence in detention also continues to be of serious concern. It has been reported that approximately 30% of those arbitrarily detained are women and girls. The office has received reports of sexual violence committed by law enforcement officials, primarily but not exclusively, against women and girls. These include reports of sexual assault, threats of sexual assault, psychological violence, and sexual harassment against both women and men. Psychological violence has reportedly been widespread, including threats of sexual assault and threats of removing the victim's children. Some of the threats were indeed realized. Excellencies, thousands of people have fled Belarus since the 2020 presidential election, many to the Czech Republic, Germany, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, among other states. I take this opportunity to remind all governments that under international law, no one should ever be prevented from seeking asylum or other forms of international protection. Reportedly, refugees and other migrants from third countries have been encouraged by the Belarus authorities to cross the country's borders with the EU states, notably Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The death of 4 people last week at the border between Belarus and Poland brought into stark focus the deplorable situation these people faced. The human rights of these individuals, including food, water, medical care, should be a paramount concern, and any claims to asylum or other protection claims should be individually examined. It is also essential that journalists, lawyers, civil society, and humanitarian actors be granted access to the border areas. Mr. Vice President, I take this opportunity to honor and thank all those who have shared their experiences and guidance with my office, including the experts and those who have experienced or witnessed human rights violations. Our report to the next session of this Council will include more detailed analysis and recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, according to our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representatives of Belarus. You have a total of 5 minutes. I understand that you will take some of your time now and some at the end of the list of speakers. You have the floor. You have the floor, sir. Belarus. You have to press the red button in front of you. Doesn't work?
That's not working. So maybe you have to change the...
May I ask the Secretariat to assist with the technical problem that the delegation of Belarus is having with the microphone? If necessary, I suggest you help the delegation move to a seat where the micro is working. It seems to be working now,
Спасибо,
so you have
уважаемая
the floor.
госпожа председатель. Господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги, мы принимаем участие в этом диалоге, чтобы выразить несогласие с рассмотрением ситуации в Беларуси по пункту 4 и подтвердить наше непризнание резолюции 4620. В связи с прозвучавшим докладом мы требуем от ОВКПЧ не принимать на себя функцию судьи, которой оно не обладает, и избегать в официальных текстах таких субъективных оценок в отношении суверенного государства, как незаконные, произвольные, репрессии и тому подобное. Отмечаем, что в докладе проигнорирована позиция правительства. Документ наполнен голословными утверждениями и фальшивыми обвинениями, не имеющими ничего общего с реальностью. Мы требуем от ОВКПЧ разъяснения относительно создания в его структуре подразделения с названием «Рассмотрение вопроса о положении в области прав человека в Беларуси», как свидетельствует письмо от неизвестного нам координатора на соответствующем бланке. Ничто, включая резолюцию 4620, не дает УВКПЧ права создавать отдельные структуры в отношении Беларуси. Выход управления за мандаты недопустим. Мы направим в УВКПЧ соответствующий запрос. Надеемся, что он не будет оставлен без письменного ответа, как это происходит с обращениями посредством в последние 2 года. Господин председатель, мы хотели бы продолжить наше выступление в конце дискуссии.
Okay, the remaining time will be available to you when you request the floor after the other speakers. We will now continue with the list of speakers of delegations who have requested the floor. The first on the list is Lithuania on behalf of a group of countries by video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Lithuania. We welcome the update and express the strong support for the mandate. No issue touched in the report should be left without proper attention, as human rights situation in Belarus continues to deteriorate. Repressions against civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, and media actors are widespread. We condemn systematic violation of human rights in Belarus, including arbitrary detentions and arrests, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence and torture, and other ill treatment of members of civil society. As Lukashenko regime is trying to silence the voices of those suffering, we call for accountability, immediate cessation of all repressions, and release of all political prisoners. We strongly condemn the Lukashenko regime's efforts to instrumentalize irregular third country migrants in an attempt to destabilize EU member states, thus putting migrants in a vulnerable situation on the territory of Belarus. International solidarity with the people of Belarus is more important than ever, as violations of human rights escalate. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the next speaker, the European Union by video statement.
The European Union remains gravely concerned about continuing attacks against human rights defenders and activists, journalists and other media workers, political opponents, members of trade unions, lawyers, representatives of civil society, and persons belonging to the Polish and other minorities in Belarus. The EU strongly calls on the Belarusian authorities to adhere to the country's international commitments and obligations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, immediately and unconditionally release and drop the charges against all those whose detention was arbitrary and politically motivated, including human rights defenders, halt the repression against civil society, and hold all those responsible for human rights violations or abuses to account. The EU continues to support international initiatives to hold all perpetrators to account, including through the Office of the High Commissioner and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. Furthermore, the EU strongly condemns the instrumentalization of vulnerable migrants and refugees. Madam High Commissioner, in your view, what are the most important steps that the international community can take to ensure full accountability for human rights violations or abuses in Belarus? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Germany by video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update. The presidential elections just over 1 year ago were a turning point in Belarusian history. Courageous people were exercising their right to peaceful protest and stood up against electoral fraud, human rights violations, and state repression. Germany stands in solidarity with the Belarusian people. However, these courageous protests were also the starting point for an unprecedented purge against all those who voice dissent. The case of Roman Protasevich shocked the world, but represents just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds still face often fabricated charges without any prospect of a fair trial. Journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists, including from Tutbi and Vyazma. We reiterate our call to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained. Impunity serves as a breeding ground for future human rights violations. We urge Belarus to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible for any human rights violations and to fully cooperate with the OHCHR-led examinations. We strongly believe that the examination mechanism on Belarus can meaningfully contribute to our accountability in Belarus. Thank you.
The next speaker is Liechtenstein by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for its interim oral update on the human rights situation in Belarus and for the indispensable work it conducts in this regard. We reiterate our strong concern over the continued environment of oppression in Belarus, severely affecting the human rights situation in the country. The continued crackdown on civil society, the political opposition, lawyers, journalists, and media workers is unacceptable and immediately needs to be put to a halt. All those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately and unconditionally, and independent, impartial, and transparent investigations into all human rights violations, including the numerous allegations of torture and sexual violence, need to be conducted so that justice can be served to the victims and survivors of these attacks and further violations can be prevented. The Belarusian authorities must respect the legitimate and democratic aspirations of its people. Civil society, the independent media, and in particular the political opposition are vital components of this and need to be respected and protected. Liechtenstein reiterates its strong call on the Belarusian authorities to immediately put a halt on the crackdown on its population and to fully cooperate with the United Nations, including the Office of the High Commissioner, as well as the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Greece by video statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Greece allies itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her update on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We continue to be gravely concerned with the continuous attacks on human rights by the authorities in Belarus. Among other serious human rights violations, we are particularly worried about incidents of intimidation, threats and assaults against journalists, bloggers and media workers, as well as reported restrictions on the access to information. The violations of the freedom of expression, both online and offline, and the freedom of the media cannot be tolerated and must cease immediately. We strongly support the demand of the Belarusian people for free and fair elections, independently monitored and in line with international standards. However, no election can be free or fair when the independent voices are silenced through arbitrary arrests, intimidation, torture, or even enforced disappearances. Greece calls for accountability against perpetrators and strongly believes that the Human Rights Council should continue being vigilant on the human rights situation in the country through all necessary monitoring, investigative and accountability mechanisms. Finally, Greece is firmly against any attempt by any country to instrumentalize the human suffering of migrants and refugees for political purposes. The orchestration of flows of migrants and refugees by the Belarusian authorities is just one more unacceptable action of exploitation of the human pain in order to advance political goals. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Slovenia by video statement.
Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for her update. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement. Slovenia strongly condemns the persecution of representatives of the civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, political opponents, members of trade unions, lawyers, and members of national minorities and their organizations. All political and other prisoners illegally detained for legitimately exercising their human rights in Belarus should be promptly released and allowed to challenge the charges brought against them. We are appalled by the instrumentalization of the illegal migration and by reports of exploitation of the vulnerable situation of migrants by the Belarus regime for political purposes. Migration must not be used in this manner, and we urge the Belarus to stop this practice. We reiterate our full support for the newly established OHCHR examination of the human rights situation in Belarus. Madam President, what further steps should the international community take to ensure that perpetrators of human rights violations in Belarus will be brought to account? Thank you.
Je donne maintenant la parole au distingué représentant de la France sur Zoom.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. La France remercie la haute-commissaire pour sa présentation. La situation en Biélorussie, plus d'un an après les élections frauduleuses du 9 août 2020, reste alarmante. La répression brutale menée par le régime d'Alexandre Loukachenko contre la société civile et le mouvement de contestation démocratique continue de s'aggraver. Nous sommes particulièrement préoccupés par le recours massif à la détention arbitraire et par les cas de torture qui nous sont rapportés. La France condamne très fermement les peines de prison de longue durée prononcées contre les opposants Maria Kolesnikova et Maxime Znak. Nous réitérons notre appel à leur libération immédiate et inconditionnelle et à celle de tous les prisonniers politiques dans le pays. La France appelle les autorités biélorusses à respecter leurs engagements internationaux en matière de respect des droits de l'homme et continuera à appliquer pleinement les sanctions européennes contre les responsables des violations graves des droits de l'homme dans ce pays. Nous réaffirmons notre soutien aux aspirations démocratiques du peuple biélorusse et renouvelons notre souhait que s'établisse un dialogue national en Biélorussie, permettant l'organisation d'élections libres et équitables sous observation internationale. Enfin, nous appelons une nouvelle fois la Biélorussie à l'abolition de la peine de mort, en commençant par l'introduction d'un moratoire. Je vous remercie.
Merci. And the next speaker is Australia with a video statement.
Australia thanks the High Commissioner and her office for their oral update. We note with deep sadness and concern the recent anniversary of flawed presidential elections in Belarus and the arrest of human rights defenders in July 2021. We have also witnessed the regrettable erosion of media independence in Belarus. Australia calls for the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained for exercising their legitimate rights to peaceful assembly, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of association. We urge Belarusian authorities to respect the rights and legitimate democratic aspirations of its people. Australia looks forward to the outcomes of the investigation by the International Civil Aviation Organisation Council into the military interception of Ryanair flight FR 4978 in May 2021. Australia also stands with its European partners in condemning those in Belarus who have facilitated the movement of desperate migrants across borders to apply pressure on neighbouring states. We request an update on the likelihood of the OHCHR and relevant special procedures mandate holders being allowed to visit Belarus to undertake an on-the-ground assessment of the human rights situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Finland for a video statement.
Chairperson, Finland aligns itself with the EU statement. Finland is gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Belarus. We are deeply worried about the repression against human rights defenders, journalists and other media workers, political opponents and civil society representatives, including arbitrary arrests and detentions. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms is an essential element of inclusive and democratic society. We urge the Belarusian government and authorities to adhere to the country's international commitments and obligations. Those detained on political grounds must immediately be released. All those responsible for persecution must be brought to justice. Finland continues to support the OHCHR and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. What urgent steps should be taken to improve the access of regional and international human rights mechanisms to Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. Et je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Suisse pour un message préenregistré.
Madame la Présidente, la Suisse remercie la Haute-Commissaire pour son compte-rendu. La Suisse reste profondément préoccupée quant à la situation des droits de l'homme au Bélarus. La persécution des représentants de l'opposition, de la société civile et des médias continue en violation des obligations internationales du Bélarus. En vertu du droit international, le Bélarus est tenu de mener des enquêtes indépendantes, transparentes et impartiales sur toutes les allégations de violation des droits de l'homme et de traduire les auteurs présumés de ces actes en justice. Or, à l'heure actuelle, nous n'avons pas connaissance de l'état d'avancement d'enquête nationale. Les mécanismes de suivi créés dans le cadre des Nations Unies, tels que la rapporteure spéciale et le mandat d'examen par le HCDH de la situation des droits de l'homme au Bélarus prévu par la résolution 4620, revêtent donc une importance majeure. Pour conclure, la Suisse réitère ses appels au gouvernement du Bélarus à libérer immédiatement et sans condition toutes les personnes détenues arbitrairement et à procéder à des enquêtes indépendantes sur toutes les allégations de violation des droits de l'homme. Madame la Haute-Commissaire, le mécanisme d'examen prévu par la résolution 4620 a-t-il pu commencer ses travaux? Dispose-t-il de ressources suffisantes pour remplir son mandat? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Et l'orateur suivant est le Luxembourg par message préenregistré.
Excellence, le Luxembourg s'associe pleinement à la déclaration présentée par l'Union européenne et remercie la Haute-Commissaire pour son compte-rendu que nous soutenons. Nous partageons les préoccupations exprimées par la Haute-Commissaire et nous souhaitons rappeler que les autorités de Minsk continuent leur campagne de répression et d'intimidation à l'encontre de la société civile. Les arrestations arbitraires, la répression des journalistes, les représailles contre les défenseuses et défenseurs des droits humains et les violations systématiques des droits humains sont tout aussi inacceptables que l'impunité qui règne par rapport à ces actes. À ces entraves des droits humains s'ajoute désormais l'ignoble instrumentalisation des migrants vulnérables à des fins politiques. Nous voudrons dans ce contexte exprimer notre pleine solidarité avec les personnes et les pays les plus touchés. Le Luxembourg souligne que la cessation des violations systématiques des droits humains, la libération des personnes détenues illégalement et l'engagement du régime dans un véritable dialogue constructif et sans préconditions avec les représentants de la société civile et de l'opposition politique sont les conditions nécessaires pour sortir de la crise actuelle. Seul le respect de la volonté démocratique des citoyens biélorusses peut mener à terme à la normalisation de la situation. Madame la Haute-Commissaire, de quels moyens la communauté internationale pourrait-elle se servir pour mieux soutenir la société civile au Bélarus, notamment pour ce qui est du soutien aux personnes les plus vulnérables telles que les réfugiés? Je vous remercie.
Merci. And now I give the floor to Lithuania for a video statement.
Lithuania welcomes the High Commissioner's report and strongly supports her mandate. Lithuania fully aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We agree with the assessment that the human rights situation in Belarus is continuously deteriorating. Widespread repressions against civil society, human rights defenders, journalists and media actors are systemically destroying civic space. Through arbitrary arrests and detentions, enforced disappearances and torture of members of civil society, Lukashenko regime is trying to silence independent voices, including women's. We support strengthening accountability mechanisms so that perpetrators of human rights violations are brought to justice. We call for immediate cessation of all repressions, release of all political prisoners. Lithuania is accepting Belarusians seeking asylum because of repressions in their own country. Lithuania appreciates all international support in responding to Lukashenko's regime's hybrid attack against EU member states and underlines that the Belarus regime cynically exploits vulnerable migrant groups for political ends. We urge Belarus to fully cooperate with all UN special procedures and human rights mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Egypt for a video statement.
يأخذ وفد مصر علما بالإحاطة الشفهية التي تم تقديمها حول حالة حقوق الإنسان في بيلاروسيا، ويعرب عن موقفه المبدئي الرافض لتسييس حقوق الإنسان واستغلالها للتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول، ويؤكد أهمية الالتزام بالمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية والقضاء على المعايير المزدوجة عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان. ويأسف وفد بلادي لاستمرار المجلس في مناقشة حالة حقوق الإنسان في بيلاروسيا وعقد هذا الحوار التفاعلي دون موافقة الدولة المعنية. ويرى وفد مصر أهمية تغليب لغة الحوار وإجراء نقاش حقيقي مع الدولة المعنية دون استخدام المجلس كأداة ضغط، مع إيلاء عناية لبناء قدرات المؤسسات الوطنية والتعاون الفني. تؤكد مصر في هذا السياق احترامها لإرادة الشعوب تطلعاتها المشروعة نحو تحقيق الديمقراطية والاستقرار، مع أهمية الحفاظ على الطابع السلمي في جميع الأوقات والنهي عن أعمال العنف. شكرا سيادة الرئيس.
Thank you. And the next speaker on the list is Austria with a video statement.
Madam High Commissioner, we would like to thank you for your interim oral update on Belarus. Since the 2020 elections, which were neither free nor fair, more than 30,000 peaceful protesters, journalists, media workers and civic activists were arrested or detained without justification. Belarusian civil society and the opposition are subjected to violence, to violation of their rights by the authorities on a daily basis. Media freedom has been further curtailed by legislative amendments. This summer alone, we had to witness the terrible death of activist Vitaly Shishkov, the mock trial against Maria Kolesnikova, her subsequent sentencing to 11 years of detention, and the attempted deportation of athlete Kristina Dimanovskaya. In addition, Lukashenko is instrumentalizing migrants and refugees as weapons against the neighboring EU countries in an unacceptable manner, exploiting their vulnerabilities for political motives. Madam High Commissioner, the Belarusian people must not be denied the justice they deserve. The widespread and systematic human rights violations and the increasing repression must be investigated. We strongly welcome the decision by this Council last March to task your office with the comprehensive examination of all human rights violations committed in the run-up and the aftermath of the 2020 elections and command the work of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. We call on Belarus to fully cooperate with your office and the experts you appointed to assist this investigation. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Albania for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente, l'Albanie remercie la Haute Commissaire pour son exposé de la situation des droits de l'homme en Biélorussie. Depuis le début de la crise politique, nous assistons à une détérioration de la situation des droits de l'homme en Biélorussie qui se résume à la répression, des interpellations et les poursuites pénales arbitraires, aux violences et des tortures en détention et les attaques contre les défenseurs de droits et les journalistes. L'arrestation du journaliste Roman Pratasevich par les autorités biélorusses ou encore la fermeture de l'association de journalistes biélorusses illustre une fois de plus cette atteinte aux droits de l'homme et aux libertés fondamentales. Nous appelons la Biélorussie à libérer toutes les personnes injustement détenues, y compris les prisonniers politiques, et demandons à mettre fin à la répression et à l'impunité. Nous partageons l'évaluation de la Haute Commissaire selon laquelle le rétablissement de la paix sociale en Biélorussie nécessite un dialogue de grande envergure et des réformes. De ce fait, le rétablissement de l'état de droit et l'indépendance du système judiciaire sont cruciales. Nous appelons les autorités biélorusses à permettre des enquêtes indépendantes, transparentes et impartiales sur toutes les allégations de violation des droits de l'homme en relation avec les élections présidentielles de 2020. Nous rappelons à la Biélorussie ses obligations en vertu du droit international des droits de l'homme. L'Albanie réitère sa position sur la nécessité de l'instauration d'un dialogue entre tous les acteurs politiques et ceux de la société civile afin d'ouvrir le chemin à la paix sociale et une future transition démocratique dans le pays. Je vous remercie.
I now give the floor to Venezuela by video statement.
Gracias, Presidenta. Condenamos categóricamente, como es conocido, las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, así como la presión externa impuestas contra el gobierno y el pueblo bielorruso. Nos opusimos a la resolución que propició este debate, la cual establece peligrosos precedentes de inaceptable injerencia en los procesos electorales de estados soberanos. Deploramos que sin mandato alguno la oficina haya establecido una misión de investigación para Bielorrusia, requiriendo cuantiosos recursos, así como la creación de 16 nuevos puestos a tal efecto. Hemos denunciado que las protestas violentas en Bielorrusia fueron financiadas y coordinadas con injerencia externa para desconocer los resultados electorales que dieron la victoria al presidente Lukashenko con más del 80% de los votos. Fue el mismo formato empleado en mi país, mediante el cual se desconoció el abrumador apoyo electoral al gobierno bolivariano para luego justificar la imposición de ilegales medidas coercitivas unilaterales. Bielorrusia sigue hoy demostrando su compromiso con la vigencia de derechos humanos, cooperando con la oficina, los procedimientos especiales temáticos y los órganos de tratados de derechos humanos. El pueblo bielorruso avanza en la redacción de la nueva constitución que definirá su futuro. Venezuela seguirá respaldando las acciones del gobierno bielorruso para mantener la paz, defender la soberanía y el derecho a la autodeterminación de su pueblo. Gracias, señora presidenta.
The next speaker is the Netherlands by video statement.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the High Commissioner for her oral update, which shows the steep worsening of the already dire human rights situation in Belarus. The Netherlands stands with the courageous people of Belarus and supports their legitimate call for democratic change. We wish to highlight the remarkable role of independent journalists, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders in and outside Belarus. More than 1 year after the stolen presidential elections, the brutal repression against peaceful opposition members, activists, and journalists continues. The arbitrary arrest, political prisoners, and administrative detentions levied against journalists continue to rise. We are deeply worried about persistent reports of torture and ill treatment of detainees. The regime in Belarus has transformed the justice system into an instrument of repression. We urge them to cease these repressive practices immediately, stop the persecution of peaceful protesters and human rights defenders, as well as the intimidation, harassment, and persecution of journalists. Those responsible must be held accountable. Madam High Commissioner, given the increased use of the Belarusian judiciary as an instrument of repression, what measures need to be taken to hold Belarus to its international obligations in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Cuba with a video statement.
Señora Presidenta, Cuba rechaza la imposición de mecanismos de derechos humanos contra países con claras motivaciones geopolíticas. Condenamos el empleo del Consejo y los mecanismos de derechos humanos para legitimar el avance de la agenda injerencista de la OTAN y sus aliados en Europa del Este. La politización y los dobles raseros que imperan en el tratamiento de los derechos humanos es inaceptable y afecta la credibilidad del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Señora Presidenta, Cuba reafirma su apoyo al pueblo y gobierno de Belarus y a su presidente Alexander Lukashenko. Reiteramos nuestro enérgico rechazo a la injerencia extranjera y a los intentos de vulnerar la soberanía y autodeterminación de ese hermano país. Muchas gracias.
I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on Zoom. Is the representative of DPRK available to take the floor on Zoom?
Can you hear me?
You have the floor, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of DPRK is of the view that report and update on Venezuela before the Council debates from the principles of objectivity and non-bias, relying on unverified and groundless information while deliberately turning a blind eye to a number of crucial issues that are important for the correct and comprehensive understanding of development in Belarus. Furthermore, the debates established a dangerous precedent of the interference in the electoral process of the UN member states by abusing the UN human rights mechanisms. It is obviously selective and politically motivated approach and proves itself that it is another attempt to manipulate the Human Rights Council in its own political interest. We commend the government of Belarus in efforts to safeguard its sovereignty, maintain the socio-political stability of the country, and commit to fulfilling its international obligations. We strongly urge the HRC to encourage the genuine dialogue and cooperation with the state, carry out the work based on its mandate, in an objective and impartial manner and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you.
The next speaker is the United States of America with a video statement.
The United States is deeply concerned by the suppression of independent political opinion in Belarus and by the Lukashenko regime's escalation of violent tactics to crush the Belarusian people's democratic aspirations. In particular, we are concerned by the growing number of politically motivated trials and the severe sentences that have followed. The regime now reportedly holds over 650 political prisoners. The regime's intensifying crackdown on civil society and independent media, including raiding media outlets, NGOs, and homes, is completely unacceptable, as is the detention of individuals simply for exercising their rights to freedom of expression, online and offline, and for peaceful assembly. The regime punishes its citizens even for wearing red and white clothing, pushing repression to absurd levels. We will always stand with Belarusians as they peacefully demand respect for their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Our question is this: what will it take for the regime to release all political prisoners, participate in a genuine dialogue, and hold free and fair elections? Thank you.
I now give the floor to the Russian Federation for a video statement.
Председатель, с сожалением отмечаем политически ангажированный характер представленного сегодня устного доклада о ситуации в Белоруссии, который содержит заранее запрограммированные выводы. Россия изначально выступала против принятия Советом резолюции, во исполнение которой был представлен сегодняшний обзор. Он стал еще одним наглядным примером грубого вмешательства во внутренние дела суверенной Белоруссии под предлогом мнимой заботы о правах человека. Рассматриваемый сегодня доклад в очередной раз доказал контрпродуктивность и бесперспективность создания политически ангажированных страновых мониторинговых механизмов, под какой бы личиной они ни учреждались. Подобный подход является неэффективным и способен лишь обострять конфронтацию. В этом контексте считаем неоправданным назначение Верховным комиссаром 3 экспертов, которым поручено изучение ситуации с правами человека в Белоруссии. Подобное решение никоим образом не вытекало из смысла поручения данного Советом. Призываем впредь воздерживаться от подобных скоропалительных решений. Благодарю за внимание.
The next speaker is Ireland with a video statement.
Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her report. More than a year since thousands of peaceful protesters took to the streets following the falsified results of presidential elections, the illegitimate government continues ruling Belarus through fear and by deploying widespread state violence against its own people. Ireland strongly condemns the systematic oppression of media freedoms and of civil society. We condemn in particular the repression of human rights defenders by the Lukashenko regime through arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances. These violations must cease immediately and perpetrators must be held to account. It is vital that our coordinated international focus remains on supporting the Belarusian people in their determined defence of democratic principles and ensuring respect for their human rights. Ireland stresses the vital importance of civil society space to ensure full enjoyment of human rights. We urge the Belarusian authorities to reverse the amendments to the laws on mass media, mass gatherings and the Code of Administrative Offences, as well as other regulations that curtail civil society's ability to express and voice opinions. Ireland calls for the immediate and unconditional release of detained human rights defenders and media workers. Madam High Commissioner, in your view, what further practical support can the international community provide to help protect human rights in Belarus? Thank you.
Maintenant, je donne la parole à la Belgique pour une déclaration préenregistrée.
More than a year has passed since the fraudulent presidential election in Belarus and the subsequent peaceful yet repressed protests. Despite the constant calls of the international community, the human rights situation has only continued to deteriorate, and the country has changed into an open-air prison where citizens are afraid to leave their homes. We reiterate our strong condemnation of the ongoing systematic and gross human rights violations. Belgium urges Belarus to immediately cease these violations and to instantly and unconditionally release and rehabilitate all arbitrarily detained persons and political prisoners, including recently convicted opposition figures Maria Kalesnikova and Maxim Znak. We call on the authorities to fully cooperate with the international initiatives such as the OHCHR accountability mechanism and the International Accountability Platform for Belarus, to which Belgium is a partner, and to implement the recommendations of the OSCE Moscow Mechanism report. We urge the Belarusian authorities to engage in a genuine and inclusive dialogue with civil society that should lead to new elections under international scrutiny, to reforms, to democracy, and to respect for human rights. Thank you.
I now give the floor to China for a video statement.
主席女士，白俄罗斯局势属于该国内政。中方一贯尊重白俄罗斯人民根据本国国情自主选择的发展道路，尊重白俄罗斯国家主权、独立和领土完整。中方相信，白俄罗斯人民能够通过自己的努力，保持政局稳定和社会安宁。希望国际社会为此发挥建设性作用。人权理事会的工作应当遵循公正、客观、非政治化、非选择性等原则，人权不应被用来实现政治目的，甚至政权更迭。一些国家自身存在严重人权问题，却借口民主、人权频繁对外干涉，制造动荡和战乱。在新冠肺炎疫情期间，仍然在强化非法单边强制措施，严重损害受害国人民的人权。国际社会应当共同反对将人权政治化、借口人权干涉别国内政的行径。谢谢主席女士。
The next speaker is the Czech Republic with a video statement.
We would like to thank the OHCHR for the update. More than a year after fraudulent presidential elections, we are deeply concerned about the continuing deterioration of the situation in Belarus. Systematic human rights violations, massive repression, and intimidation campaign against civil society and independent media. Thousands of people are facing harsh state harassment, illegal persecutions, and arrests. The rule of law has been violated on many occasions in Belarus during Lukashenko's presidency, but now the lawlessness seems to have prevailed in the country. The persecution of peaceful protesters, journalists, and the members of the Opposition Coordination Council is unacceptable. We are especially concerned about credible reports of severe abuse of detainees. All those who were unlawfully detained must be released. Furthermore, we are extremely worried by cases of torture of political prisoners. We call for an immediate and unconditional release of journalist Ihar Losik, as well as all of those arbitrarily detained. We support independent international investigation of all atrocities by appropriate mechanisms. Space for civil society in Belarus has constantly been shrinking throughout the last decade. In the past few months, we observe a systematic campaign against all non-governmental organizations and independent media with a clear aim to muzzle all independent voices in the country. This is intolerable. We continue to support the struggle of Belarusians for democracy and fundamental rights.
And I give the floor to Croatia for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her update. Croatia reaffirms its strong condemnation of the systematic human rights violations and focused attacks against members of the civil society in Belarus. Our main concern remains well-being of detainees and other persons deprived of their liberty who undergo degrading treatment or punishment through sexual violence, deprivation of food, water, and medical assistance. We once again appeal to the Belarus authorities for immediate and unconditional release of all prisoners whose detention was politically motivated. Reported cases of torture require thorough investigations in order to bring perpetrators to justice. Moreover, we call the authorities to cooperate with international and regional human rights monitoring mechanisms. We strongly oppose the exploitation of migrants and refugees for political purpose and redirection of their flow towards the EU borders. Finally, Croatia remains a strong advisor against death penalty and echoes its plea to Belarus for introducing a moratorium as a first step. I thank you.
And now I give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic on Zoom.
شكرا. شكل القرار 46/20 الذي يستند إليه هذا التحديث الشفوي سابقة خطيرة في التدخل في الشؤون الداخلية للدول، خاصة محاولة تقييم العملية الانتخابية في دولة عضو في الأمم المتحدة، وجاء ذلك في سياق حملة ضغوط سياسية على هذا البلد بذريعة حرص مزعوم على حقوق الإنسان. تثير منهجية إعداد التقارير والتحديثات الشفوية الصادرة عن المفوضية بشأن بيلاروسيا مشاغل حقيقية، وعلى رأسها إغفال عناصر جوهرية لفهم الأوضاع في هذا البلد، وعدم إيلاء المعلومات التي قدمتها الحكومة البيلاروسية الاهتمام الواجب، وهو ما ينزع الموضوعية عن استنتاجاتها وتوصياتها. تجدد سوريا رفضها لتفسير ولاية المفوضية بما يخالف الأطر المعاييرية التي نصت عليها قرارات الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة أو بما يتجاوز قرارات مجلس حقوق الإنسان، وتشدد على أهمية وضع أسس واضحة ومتفق عليها دولياً لتعيين أعضاء الهيئات التحقيقية التابعة للمجلس وتحديد مرجعية واضحة لعملهم ضماناً لاستقلالية عمل هذه الهيئات وموضوعية تقاريرها. وتؤكد سوريا أخيراً دعمها لبيلاروس في مواجهة الضغوط السياسية ومحاولات التدخل في شؤونها الداخلية، وتدين التدابير الانفرادية القسرية المفروضة عليها. شكراً السيد نائب الرئيس.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Estonia for a video statement.
Fully aligns with the statement delivered by the EU. We welcome the update of the OHCHR and express our strong support for their mandate. Estonia remains seriously concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus. Lukashenko's regime has continued and intensified its repression against the Belarusian people. A massive crackdown on human rights defenders, journalists and other media workers, as well as on political opponents and civil society organizations, is continuing with impunity. On 6th of September, 2 political prisoners and members of the Executive Board of the Coordination Council of Democratic Belarus, Mrs. Kolesnikova and Mr. Znak, were sentenced to 11 and 10 years in prison respectively. There are over 650 political prisoners in Belarus. We call on Belarusian authorities to release all political prisoners unconditionally, without delay, and without pressure of writing clemency petitions, otherwise the safety and well-being of the prisoners' relatives and loved ones is threatened to be put at risk. The Belarusian regime has begun to turn the domestic crisis into regional instability. They have weaponized migration by taking advantage of citizens in vulnerable situations from third countries to fuel illegal border crossings from Belarus to neighboring EU member states. The international community must consistently demand from Lukashenko's regime the international provocations and instrumentalization of migrants and refugees must be stopped immediately. All perpetrators of the crimes must be brought to justice and punished. Democratic elections must be held. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Ukraine on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ukraine appreciates the update by the High Commissioner. We remain troubled by the reports of torture and other inhumane or degraded treatment, excessive use of force, persecution of journalists and human rights defenders, as well as other abuses in Belarus, multiplied by demonstrative impunity for the perpetrators. 4 days ago, Ukrainian citizen Mikhailo Forenets was sentenced in Belarus to 3 years in prison for allegedly participating in actions that violate public order, despite the absence of reliable evidence of his guilt. Ukraine considers this verdict to be politically motivated, unfair and illegal, and demands an unconditional release of Ukraine's citizen. The case of Mikhailo Forenets is another example of Belarusian so-called justice, as a result of which hundreds of local journalists and human rights activists, students and ordinary citizens have been imprisoned. We once again call on the Belarusian authorities to end repressions, release all political prisoners, engage with the UN human rights mechanisms, and start an inclusive dialogue with Belarusian society. Ukraine also warns the Russian Federation against its cynical attempts to take advantage of the situation in Belarus and undermine its sovereignty. Ukraine reiterated support for the independence of Belarus and the ambition of its people to live in a free, democratic European state in which the voice of every citizen is taken into account. I thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Poland for a video statement.
Madam President, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. We support the mandate of the OHCHR-based mechanism regarding human rights violation in Belarus. We welcome this oral interim update of the mechanism's activity. Poland is extremely concerned about the continuously deteriorating human rights situation since last presidential elections. We firmly oppose the massive violations of human rights by the authorities and underline the need to respect international human rights law, including rights of persons belonging to national minorities. We strongly deplore brutal persecutions of human rights defenders and journalists, marked by liquidation of the Belarusian Association of Journalists, raids and searches of independent media outlets and civil society organizations, including Vyasna. These developments are complemented by hybrid acts of Belarus authorities violating human rights, such as arbitrary detention of dissident blogger Roman Protasevich and recent cynical instrumentalization of migrants used to create an artificial pressure on the EU external borders. Poland reiterates its call to Belarus to immediately release all imprisoned dissidents, including former presidential candidates, human rights defenders and lawyers, among them Aleś Białacki, Valentin Stefanovich, Vladimir Lapkovich, Maxim Znak, leaders of the Union of Poles in Belarus, Angelika Boris and Andrzej Poczobut, independent journalists Katarina Andreeva and Daria Chultsova, and almost 700 other political prisoners. We urge Belarus authorities to stop human rights violations and to bring all the responsible to justice. Question: what kind of support to the mechanism's work by the international community would be needed in the nearest future? I thank you.
I now give the floor to Latvia for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Latvia fully aligns with the EU and Nordic Baltic statements. Latvia remains deeply concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Belarus and reiterates the call for the Belarusian authorities to comply with its international human rights obligations and to cooperate in a genuine and meaningful manner with the OHCHR, as well as with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. We condemn the targeting of civil society actors, human rights defenders, political opponents, journalists, and media workers by the Belarusian authorities and call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained. We also condemn the instrumentalization of vulnerable citizens of third countries for a hybrid attack on the EU and NATO eastern borders with the aim of destabilizing the region. We urge Belarus to stop this operation and to ensure the right of freedom of innocent people under its jurisdiction. Latvia fully supports the monitoring mandate of the OHCHR and looks forward to the working report to be presented in the next session. In this regard, what challenge of OHCHR is facing in implementing the mandate and how can the international community help? Thank you, Madam President.
The next speaker is the distinguished representative of Slovakia. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovakia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union delivered previously. Allow me, though, to add a few comments in my national capacity. Slovakia follows and will follow and continue to follow very closely the developments of the human rights situation in Belarus, and confirmation of this is also my presence in person today. To our regret and concern, the situation in Belarus is not developing for the good. This is not only our observation, it continues to attract the interests of international scene. The closure of Belarusian Association of Journalists 3 weeks ago, arbitrary harsh prison sentences for political prisoners Maria Kaliesnikova and Maxim Znak 2 weeks ago, or already mentioned continuous practice of orchestration of flows of vulnerable groups of migrants and refugees across the border, to name just a few. We welcome the fact that 3 independent experts nominated by you, Madam High Commissioner, can now fulfill their mandate. We note with satisfaction that they can profit from numerous independent sources of information, including from International Accountability Platform for Belarus. This information is of paramount importance with a view to provide justice and accountability. This is even more crucial now when we note with concern that there is no presence of OHCHR in Belarus, and the Investigative Committee of Belarus announced not to initiate any criminal investigation of the complaints of numerous human rights violations. To conclude, Slovakia calls on authorities in Belarus to abide by its international human rights commitments, as well as to engage in dialogue and cooperation with the OHCHR, with the aim to investigate and rectify all human rights violations that occurred in the run-up of the 2020 presidential elections and in its
thank you,
aftermath.
sir. I thank you. Time is up. Thank you. I now give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom would like to thank the High Commissioner for the update on human rights situation in Belarus. More than a year has passed since the fraudulent presidential elections, and yet Lukashenko's campaign of repression continues unabated. The forced landing of Ryanair flight FR4978 and the arrest of Roman Protasevich on May 23rd was a shocking assault on human rights, international law and civil aviation. The UK continues to urge the Belarusian authorities to release Protasevich and his partner Sofia Sapiga from house arrest. Protasevich is one of more than 650 political prisoners being held by the Belarusian authorities. The UK is also appalled at the sentencing of Maria Kolesnikova and Maxim Nak. This crisis will not be solved while Lukashenko continues to target all those who oppose him, rather than engaging in open, democratic debate with them. Belarusian authorities continue to systematically target civil society and non-state media. Authorities have blocked access to or shut down at least 23 independent news websites and liquidated hundreds of civil society organisations, including the Belarusian Association of Journalists, the Belarusian Penn Centre and the Office for Rights of People with Disabilities. Madam High Commissioner, what more can the international community do to support civil society and independent media in Belarus? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now invite the next speaker, the Republic of Moldova, to take the floor on Zoom. Moldova seems not to be available. And I give the floor to the next speaker, Bulgaria. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bulgaria aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for the interim oral update. We strongly support the mandate and the activities of the three high-level experts. We remain deeply concerned over the serious violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Belarus. The Republic of Bulgaria and the European Union are determined to support the Belarusian people in their legitimate right and demand for a better future. The recent wave of repressions against civil society and independent media that culminated in the order for the liquidation of the Belarusian Association of Journalists warrants a condemnation by the international community. The recent sentencing of two prominent opposition figures, Maria Kolesnikova and Maxim Znak, is another unacceptable act. Bulgaria adheres to the international efforts aimed at resolving the political crisis in the country through credible and inclusive political process resulting in new, free and fair elections under international scrutiny. Bulgaria supports the international initiatives to hold all perpetrators of grave human rights violations to account, including through the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. We stand in full solidarity with the European member states that are most severely affected by actions to instrumentalize illegal migration as a tool for putting pressure on the EU. Such a behavior is unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Romania for a video statement.
Madam President, Romania aligns itself with the statement delivered by the EU. We'd like to thank the High Commissioner and the OHCHR for the interim oral update on the situation of human rights in Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential elections and its aftermath. We remain deeply concerned by the constant deterioration of the internal situation in Belarus and the continuation of serious and systematic human rights violations in this country. We call for stopping the repression and the initiation of a peaceful, inclusive political dialogue. Romania reaffirms its will to support the people of Belarus in building a democratic path through a state leadership democratically elected, a free civil society and the rule of law. Since the beginning of events in Belarus, Romania has actively expressed its concerns by political declarations at high level and by coordinating its actions within the international community to address the violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms, being one of the countries who invoked the OSCE's Moscow mechanism and supported the creation of the International Accountability Platform for Belarus. We deeply regret the continuation of the discriminatory restrictions on fundamental freedoms such as freedom of assembly, association, and expression, resulting in the systematic harassment of independent media, over the mass arbitrary detentions and arrest of media workers, human rights defenders, lawyers, and activists with different opinions. We urge the government of Belarus to carry out a comprehensive review of legislation, policy, and practices in line with its international human rights obligations and commitments, to refrain from further violations of human rights, and to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Nicaragua by video statement.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Nuevamente nos encontramos en este Consejo con la ejecución de mandatos que no cuentan con el apoyo del país concernido y son rechazados constantemente. Estas dudosas metodologías de trabajo que están lejos de contribuir a mejorar la situación en Belarus. El gobierno de Nicaragua reconoce la voluntad del gobierno de Belarus para trabajar de forma transparente y comprometida con los mecanismos de este Consejo, así como con la oficina de la Alta Comisionada. Agradecemos la información compartida por Belarus y respaldamos la iniciativa para promover la interacción sobre cuestiones de derechos humanos, en un formato de diálogo igualitario que genere el ecosistema propicio para el fomento de la cooperación constructiva entre las naciones del mundo. Señora Presidente, la injerencia extranjera en asuntos internos de otros estados siempre ha dado como resultado inestabilidad política y social. Por ello, el desarrollo de acciones encaminadas a agredir y someter sistemáticamente a países que se abaten en sus propios problemas y trabajan arduamente para superarlos debe ser ampliamente condenado. Nicaragua se solidariza con el pueblo de Belarus y hacemos un llamado a los países miembros para multiplicar esfuerzos a favor de generar condiciones de respeto a la decisión soberana y democrática de todos los pueblos. Muchas gracias.
I now give the floor to Iran on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Council should fulfill its mandates in protection and promotion of human rights through dialogue and cooperation in accordance with the principle of non-selectivity, objectivity, and impartiality. The UN human rights mechanisms, and principally this Council, should not be misused to score political gains against any member states. Iran rejects the imposition of unilateral, coercive, and restrictive measures against Belarus. The sanctioned state must be held to account for the devastating human rights implications of such unlawful unilateral measures. The sovereignty, as well as the right of all nations to freely determine their political status and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, shall be respected without external interference and pressure. We appreciate the continuing commitment of Belarus to engage constructively with the relevant human rights mechanisms, including with the UPR mechanism. We congratulate Belarus for its successful engagement in its third cycle of UPR, where it demonstrated its commitment in fulfilling its international human rights obligation. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Sri Lanka by video statement.
Madam President, Belarus has stated in clear terms its commitment to fulfilling its human rights obligations. Despite this, an adversarial resolution has been imposed on Belarus, contravening the spirit in which human rights work should be conducted. Resolution 46/20, pursuant to which this update on Belarus is presented, contravenes GA Resolution 48/141 by conferring on the OHCHR an evidence-collecting role, a task that was never envisaged or sanctioned by the General Assembly for this subsidiary body. Any action that flows from such an unsanctioned initiative, therefore, lacks legal basis and legitimacy. We also remain concerned about the excessive amount of funds and human resources to be invested in this resolution. Over $2.5 million and 16 personnel, when such resources are urgently required to address pressing humanitarian situations elsewhere. We reiterate our opposition to the selective adoption of country-specific resolutions and urge that the fundamental principles of sovereignty and non-interference enshrined in the UN Charter be respected in the work of the HRC at all times. In conclusion, we encourage this Council to engage in a positive dialogue with the government of Belarus. Thank you.
The next speaker is Iceland with a video statement.
I thank you, Madam President, and I thank the High Commissioner for her oral update.
The situation in Belarus remains alarming as Lukashenko's regime continues to disregard the human rights of the Belarusian people. Repression of political activists, human rights defenders, athletes and others who dare to express their views must stop. The number of political prisoners in Belarus continues to rise, with politically driven sentencing used to silence opposition. Reports of torture and other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, including sexual and gender-based violence, are greatly concerning. We urge the Belarusian authorities to immediately release all those who are unlawfully detained. Moreover, we condemn the instrumentalization of migrants on the border of Lithuania, Latvia and Poland, and call on the Belarusian authorities to immediately cease those hybrid tactics. Iceland will continue to stand by the Belarusian people in the legitimate quest for a democratic, independent and prosperous Belarus. We call on the regime to respect human rights and to foster a climate where a real dialogue on human rights and democracy can take place. I thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon on Zoom.
السيد الرئيس، يشكر لبنان مكتب المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان على إحاطتها الشفوية، وفي هذا السياق ندلي بالملاحظات التالية. يشدد لبنان على أهمية المبادئ التي تشكل دعائم هذا المجلس، ولعل أبرزها تعزيز حالة حقوق الإنسان من خلال التعاون والحوار البناء بين المفوضية والدول، وأهمية بناء القدرات وذلك بعيدا عن الانتقائية والمعايير المزدوجة. كما نعتبر أن نجاح مداولات المجلس يتوقف إلى حد بعيد على احترام التعددية انسجاما مع المبادئ الأساسية المنصوص عليها في ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، وعلى رأسها احترام سيادة الدول وتجنب التدخل في شؤونها الداخلية واحترام وحدة وسلامة أراضيها. يشجع لبنان السلطات في بيلاروس على الانفتاح على المفوضية والاستمرار في بذل الجهود لمعالجة الأزمة السياسية التي تمر بها البلاد، وذلك من خلال تغليب لغة الحوار في إطار جامع لكافة مكونات المجتمع البيلاروسي. كما ندعو المفوضية إلى التعاون مع السلطات البيلاروسية لإدراك الهدف المنشود. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Tajikistan for a video statement.
We consider the Human Rights Council Resolution 45/1 as an instrument of political pressure. It has dealt selectively with the human rights situation in Belarus. It's impossible to work within the framework of such instruments, which seek to influence and develop a sovereign state by imposing an arbitrary and one-sided reading of international human rights obligation. Belarus acted in full compliance with its obligation, inviting international partners to take part in the presidential election as observers, including the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The economic sanctions imposed afterwards undermined normal economic activity in the country, which will inevitably have a negative impact on all segments of the population and the possibility of realizing economic and social human rights. It should be noted that the socio-political situation in the country is now normalized and predictable, with therefore stress unacceptability of external pressure, including unilateral sanctions and the restriction on the people of Belarus. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Azerbaijan on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Azerbaijan's bilateral relations with Belarus are based on support to each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. As a matter of principle, Azerbaijan stands for respect of sovereign equality, political independence, and non-interference in the internal affairs of the UN member states. We would like to emphasize that all matters falling into the domestic jurisdiction of UN member states, including that of Belarus, have to be resolved through a political dialogue on the basis of rule of law and constitutional order of the states. I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Cambodia for a video statement.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation takes notes of the relevant update as to the situation in Belarus.
Belarus' High Human Development Index, its full commitment to fulfilling the international human rights obligation, and its constructive cooperation with the Council's Matic Special Procedures, human rights treaties bodies, and the UPR should be recognized. The enduring strength of all human rights mechanisms lies in even-handed approach with transparency, objectivity, and impartiality, as well as in full adherence to the principles of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference, which are well enshrined in the UN Charter. The activities should be guided by the objective of achieving healthy international cooperation rather than naming and shaming. As the international community, we can keep our role within a constructive framework by demonstrating empathy and prudence. It is evident that one-size-fits-all approach would be counterproductive given different contexts of the country. Cambodia reiterates its principal position that human rights agenda must be addressed through a genuine dialogue-based approach with non-confrontation, non-politicization, and non-selectivity based on verified source of information, bearing in mind the national particularities and priorities of each country. Thank you.
And the next speaker is Kazakhstan with a video statement.
Dear Chair, Kazakhstan and Belarus have been traditionally enjoying friendly relations based on their common history, developing them both in bilateral and multilateral dimensions, as well as close cooperation within regional organizations, such as the Commonwealth of Independent States, Eurasian Economic Union, and Collective Security Treaty Organization. Belarus has repeatedly declared its intention to undertake political transformations through a wide national dialogue and referendum on the constitution in the near future. We believe that people of Belarus will determine their future according to its strategic interests and in full conformity with its national legislation, international norms, in the framework of a peaceful, wise, and inclusive dialogue. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Lao People's Democratic Republic on Zoom.
Vice President, I thank Belarus for the update. We commend Belarus for the progress made in drafting a new constitution and its continued commitment to fulfilling its international human rights obligation, including the implementation of the third cycle of its UPR. But, Mr. Vice President, the UN human rights mechanism play an important role in delivering concrete and meaningful human rights impacts on the ground. Thus, they should not be used as a tool to interfere in international affairs of the states, but to address human rights issues within the global context through a constructive, non-confrontational, non-politicized, non-selective, and dialogue-based approach in a fair and equal manner with objectivity, respect for national sovereignty, and territorial integrity and impartiality. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Eritrea on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Eritrea maintains its strong opposition to the increasing practice of establishing country-specific mandates under several pretexts. It serves no purpose on the promotion of human rights. It rather derails cooperation and confidence-building measures that could have potentially benefited the people. Unfortunately, we see repeated efforts to bring countries of the South one after another under agenda items 2, 4, and 10 without the consent of the states concerned, leading to ineffective use of the time and the resources of the duplicate mandate of the Human Rights Council. Eritrea welcomes the various initiatives that the government of Belarus continues to take to improve its human rights record for its subject, including through the implementation of the recommendations of the working group of the Universal Periodic Review and the growing engagement with the international community. In conclusion, Mr. Vice President, Eritrea reaffirms its commitment to redouble its efforts in the promotion of human rights, at the same time intensifying its struggle against politicization and double standards of the work of the Council. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And this was the last delegation having requested the floor. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to the representative of the Right Livelihood Award Foundation.
Madam President, as of September 22nd, Belarus counted 672 political prisoners. That is 146 more since we last addressed the Council. Such numbers are not only likely to continue to increase, but might become unavailable to us as the Lukashenko regime persists in its attempt to wipe out civil society. Right Livelihood Laureate Human Rights Center Vyazna has been playing a leading role in advocating for democracy and the rule of law in Belarus, documenting human rights abuses for the past 25 years. To date, 7 of its members, Ales Bialyatsky, Valentin Stefanovic, Uladzimir Lapkovich, Marfa Rabkova, Tatiana Lastitsa, Andrei Chapliuk, and Leonid Sudalenka are arbitrarily detained. 7 others are suspects in the same case, and several were forced to leave the country. While activists are being given unfair sentences, real perpetrators of human rights abuses are enjoying complete impunity, as the investigative committee decided not to open any criminal cases, despite having received almost 700 allegations of ill treatment and torture on post-election protesters. We urge all member states to ensure that the OHCHR examination mechanism on Belarus has the necessary resources to carry out its mandate. Continued scrutiny is crucial in ensuring accountability. We also urge the authorities to abide by their international obligations and respect the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. Lastly, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of the Vyazna 7 and for theirs and all other members' charges to be dropped. Thank you.
The next speaker is the Human Rights House Foundation.
The Human Rights Council mandated the examination of Belarus. The human rights situation has further deteriorated. Many of our Belarusian colleagues and friends are now in detention or prison as a result of their human rights work, and almost all others have been forced to flee the country. The Belarusian government has sought to drastically weaken independent civil society with arrests and the liquidation of NGOs. We particularly highlight the case of Marfa Rabkova, who has now spent over a year in prison for her human rights work. We call on the Council to raise her case and others with the Belarusian authorities and to push for their release. The right response of the Human Rights Council is to continue its close scrutiny of the situation and to maintain its pressure on Belarus to implement the Council's recommendations and honour its human rights commitments. Member and observer states should also be ensuring full support for the examination and the position of the Special Rapporteur. President, we have been disappointed that the new OHCHR examination has not received all of the funding that the Council signed off on at HRC 36. We are also worried that it has taken far longer to become fully operational than originally anticipated. We ask the High Commissioner whether the positions envisaged in the budget for this year that have been cut will be included in next year's budget. We also ask her whether it is realistic that the examination can complete its mandate in the time remaining. Thank you.
I give the floor to the International Bar Association, which will deliver a joint statement on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
Thank you. International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, Lawyers for Lawyers, the Law Society of England and Wales, and Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada remain deeply concerned that since this Council mandated the OHCHR examination, the human rights situation in Belarus has further deteriorated with ongoing persecution and repression of legal professionals, journalists, human rights defenders, and political opponents. The Belarusian authorities continue to use unfunded criminal proceedings against them. At least 23 lawyers have been disbarred since 2020. More than 200 NGOs and media organizations have been shut down or are in the process thereof. 28 journalists are currently detained. We strongly condemn the recent sentencing of opposition figure Maria Kolesnikova and lawyer Maxim Znak to 11 and 10 years imprisonment, respectively, following a closed-door trial. We further condemn recent reports that death row prisoner Viktor Skudrunzik has been executed and urge Belarus to introduce a moratorium on death penalty with a view to the abolition. Madam President, This Council must take all possible actions to ensure accountability for abuses and prevent further deterioration of the situation. We call on this Council to fully support the OHCHR examination and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus through adequate funding and resources, and to operationalize the OHCHR examination without any further delay. We thank you.
The next speaker is the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Madam President, I speak on behalf of my Belarusian colleagues on the ground who can no longer speak publicly in this forum because they are either in prison or face reprisals by the Belarusian government. We are deeply concerned that the repeated signals sent by the international community, and this Council in particular, continue to be ignored by the Belarusian authorities. We strongly condemn the escalation of attacks over the summer against well-established organizations such as Vyasna, the Belarusian Helsinki Committee, and the Belarusian Association of Journalists, and many others, which are eviscerating the last independent civil society actors in Belarus. They have long documented human rights violations independently and reported them at the local, regional, and international level, including before UN bodies and mechanisms. We reaffirm the important role of human rights defenders and call for the immediate and unconditional release of detained human rights defenders, as well as other political prisoners, now being more than 653. We further ask that charges against all those criminally investigated on spurious grounds are dropped. We insist that Ales Bialycki, Valentin Stefanovic, Vladimir Lapkovich, Marfa Rabkova, Leonid Sudalenka, Andrei Chepyuk, Tatiana Lasitsa, Maria Tarasenka, and Andrei Alexandrov, who have been vocal and visible representatives of the independent civil society in Belarus, be immediately and unconditionally released and rehabilitated. Finally, we call on all states to stand with human rights defenders, independent voices, and all the people oppressed in Belarus. I thank you.
I now give the floor to Article 19, the International Center Against Censorship.
Article 19 Access Now, International Media Support and PEN America thank the High Commissioner for her oral update on Belarus. Belarus continues to face the largest human rights crisis in its modern history. Over 35,000 people have been subjected to arbitrary detention in degrading conditions, with 674 people recognized as political prisoners, and almost all civil society organizations have been forcibly disbanded by the authorities. The Belarusian authorities continue to take deliberate action to eliminate independent media. Currently, there are 27 journalists and 54 cultural workers behind bars. The widespread repression disproportionately impacts members of groups at risk of discrimination. The Belarusian legal framework has been developed as a tool to silence dissenting voices. In May, amendments to existing laws were introduced to ban any form of public protest against the authorities. In modern-day Belarus, volunteering to assemble food packages to political prisoners is qualified as financial extremism, while prisoners are physically labeled with prone to extremism badges. The crisis is equally present online and offline. In the spirit of digital authoritarianism, online civil resistance tools, including Telegram chats and channels, online media outlets, and civic tech initiatives, are labeled extremist. In May, Alexander Lukashenko passed a law which legalized the power to shut down the internet. We call on the OHCHR to examine and provide recommendations on the abuse of legislation and the court system to criminalize the right to freedom of expression and to repress journalists, activists, and other civil society actors. We also urge the Council to ensure that the examination on the human rights situation in Belarus is properly resourced with adequate budget and personnel. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the World Organization Against Torture.
Madam President, there is an ongoing siege against independent voices in Belarus, and we must act. Only in July, more than 100 searches targeted the offices and homes of civil society organizations, journalists, and activists. In the past few months, more than 250 NGOs have been shut down, including human rights organizations Lotren, Human Constanta, and the Belarusian Association of Journalists. The crackdown against independent media continues as well. This summer, the searches and detentions targeted independent media Nasha Niva and independent press agency Belapan. Torture and other serious human rights violations remain shielded from investigation. In August, the State Investigative Committee dismissed no less than 680 torture complaints filed in August 2020 by simply arguing the claims were false. And only last week, the investigation of the killing of Raman Bandarenka, a peaceful protester who died in police custody in November 2020, was suspended. We have to act, and we call on the members of this Council to urge Belarus to put an immediate end to the persecution and harassment of political opponents, human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists, as well as to conduct effective investigations into all allegations of human rights violations in the context of peaceful protest. Finally, we urge all states to join our voices and demand the release of all those arbitrarily detained, including our 7 Vyazna colleagues and friends currently in detention. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is the International Commission of Jurists.
Madam President, the ICJ is concerned at continuing human rights violations in Belarus amidst the continued lack of cooperation with international mechanisms, including the Syrian Special Rapporteur. The ICJ draws the Council's attention to the recent conviction following an unfair trial of Maria Kolesnikova, key opposition leader, and lawyer Maxim Znak on spurious national security charges. This is part of a continuing pattern of arbitrary disbarments and other disciplinary proceedings against lawyers, including the recent disbarment of Dmitry Laevsky, who represented Viktor Babariko, a former presidential candidate, Alexei Telegin, Valery Itsiagintsev, Yekaterina Zeltonoga, Andrei Gashinsky, Andrei Mohalov, Mikhail Butrachuk. The ability of a free independent bar to carry out its work unimpeded is indispensable for the protection of human rights and access to justice. The ICJ calls on the Council and its member states to address the human rights situation with a view to securing the immediate release of Maria Kolesnikova, Maxim Znak, and all others arbitrarily convicted, the dismissal of any charges against those facing prosecution as a result of exercise of their human rights, and providing effective remedies for human rights violations, ensuring that lawyers can exercise their professional duty without harassment, intimidation, and other improper influence, the full cooperation of Belarus with international mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
I now give the floor to Ingenieur Dumont for a joint statement on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
The presidential election in Belarus was stolen. It caused mass protests and a profound political and human rights crisis unprecedented for 21st century Europe. More than 40,000 peaceful protesters were detained. Among them, more than 580 were journalists. Today, almost 700 are recognized political prisoners. Thousands are still in jail, and at least 10 were killed. This barbarity has now become a challenge for regional and international security. Lukashenko's regime hijacks the airplane, uses irregular migrants as a human weapon, and threatens neighboring countries with military aggression. This terrorism has to be stopped. To do this, I call on to support the mandate of the examination effort established by the HRC Resolutions 4620 and the important work of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus, and to implement the recommendations of the OSCE's Moscow Mechanism report. Belarusian questions should also be put on the agenda of the UN Security Council and be considered in the Third Committee. Justice must prevail, and it will.
The next speaker is the Advocates for Human Rights.
The Advocates for Human Rights thanks the OHCHR for its interim oral update on the situation in Belarus. We especially welcome the focus on the post-election violence, detention conditions, and reprisals against human rights defenders and civil society. The Advocates for Human Rights shares these concerns. Police used excessive force against peaceful protesters, causing bruises, broken bones, and other physical injuries. Thousands were arbitrarily detained. Prison officials crowded detainees into small cells, even forcing 120 people into one. Women experienced both sexual violence and threats of rape while in detention. Those who reported these violations were threatened with harm to their children and with persecution themselves if they did not drop their complaints. The government has harassed and intimidated human rights defenders and civil society in the election's aftermath, accusing some individuals and NGOs of violating the criminal code by financing mass protests as pretense to arrest and detain them. Several activists have fled the country for their safety. Others have been arbitrarily arrested and detained. We reiterate calls for the government to release immediately and rehabilitate all those arbitrarily detained, and prosecution of human rights defenders, conduct investigations into human rights violations surrounding the protest, and bring perpetrators of these violations to justice. Thank you.
And this was the last speaker on my list. I now give the floor to the representative of Belarus for final remarks. You have 3 minutes, 25 seconds, sir.
Мы признательны всем государствам, выразившим поддержку Беларуси и осудившим действия стран Запада по вмешательству в наши внутренние дела. Помимо трибуны ООН, Запад использует для давления на Беларусь широкий набор мер, все компоненты гибридной войны. Эти меры под предлогом защиты прав человека направлены на искусственную мобилизацию протестных настроений, подстрекательство радикалов на противоправные формы протестов, несущих угрозу обществу и государству. Главная же цель этого процесса – революционная смена власти и в конечном счете смена геополитической ориентации страны, которая является стратегическим партнером России и Китая в центре Европы. Использование трибуны ООН страны Запада против Беларуси преследует единственную цель – оправдать в глазах их общественности экономические ограничительные меры, введенные против Беларуси. Ведь очевидно, что они несут вред как белорусским гражданам, так и гражданам и компаниям стран Запада, лишая их результатов и перспектив сотрудничества с нашей страной. Мы отвергаем обвинения в политическом использовании миграции. Мы отвечаем на них открытостью, в отличие от наших соседей, которые вводят чрезвычайное положение, чтобы легче скрывать правду от журналистов. Сегодня очередная делегация ВКБ завершила работу в Беларуси. Коротко о развитии ситуации в стране. Попытка государственного мятежа, когда меньшинство пыталось украсть победу у большинства на выборах путем противоправных акций на улицах, провалилась. Протесты и беспорядки в Беларуси в августе 2020 года, как показало следствие и суды, имели своих вдохновителей и организаторов и в Беларуси, и за рубежом. Конкретные лица осуждены за сговор с целью захвата власти, организацию беспорядков, управление протестами, участие в противоправных акциях, за разжигание вражды и в обществе. Лица, которые сбежали от ответственности за рубеж, продолжают свое существование в YouTube, общаясь там с мизерным числом своих сторонников. Обеды некоторых из них в президентских дворцах западных стран ничего не изменят. Государство продолжает выявлять конкретных лиц, виновных в организации и участии в беспорядках, и привлекать их к ответственности в соответствии с законом. Государство продолжает проверки НПО и медиаресурсов, чья работа содействовала противоправным актам и уличным протестам. Наиболее частые нарушения – это деятельность, не соответствующая уставу, нецелевое расходование средств, в том числе на финансирование протестов, оплату штрафов, распространение экстремистской информации, подстрекательского деструктивного характера, а также призывов к санкциям третьих стран, наносящих ущерб национальной безопасности. В отношении организаций, нарушивших закон, применяются правовые меры вплоть до ликвидации. В итоге в Беларуси восстановлен порядок, люди работают и ведут нормальный образ жизни. Следственные органы завершили проверки жалоб на действия милиции, связанные с применением к протестовавшим насилия и спецсредств. Собранные доказательства позволили заявить, что распространявшиеся в СМИ, в соцсетях, а также с этой трибуны заявления о якобы имевшем место превышении служебных полномочий, выразившихся в пытках, сексуальном, гендерном насилии, не нашли подтверждения. В стране продолжается запущенный президентом процесс общественного обсуждения и анализа ситуации. Его цель – способствовать единству общества, выработать подходы к эволюции политической и государственной системы в новых реалиях и вызовах современности. За год проведены сотни диалоговых встреч с участием депутатов, чиновников, заинтересованных граждан по всей стране. В Конституционной комиссии изучены тысячи предложений по изменению основного закона. Ожидается, что важнейшие решения будут приняты на референдуме в начале будущего года. Уважаемый господин председатель, с учетом того, что мы сэкономили огромное количество времени, не будете ли вы так любезны дать мне еще минуту для комментариев?
Please go ahead. There is no translation, I understand. Excuse me, there is no translation. I would like the interpreters to... Yes, you can continue, sir.
Спасибо большое. Я начну сначала. Как пример исключительных по своему лицемерию действий ЕС, напомню, инцидент с рейсом Ryanair в небе над Беларусью. Прошло 4 месяца, но ИКАО молчит по поводу выдуманных Западом обвинений Беларуси в принудительной посадке самолета. Молчание золото. Эксперты организации прекрасно знают, что Беларусь не нарушала никаких правил в этом случае. И если отчет ИКАО и выйдет в ближайшее время, то лишь отсрочит неминуемый позор. На основе фантазий, домыслов и откровенной лжи вдумайтесь только, решением министров Евросоюза национальному авиаперевозчику Беларуси запрещены все полеты над большинством европейских стран, а европейским компаниям запрещено летать в Беларусь. Огромное количество людей лишились права человека на свободу передвижения удобным им образом из-за европейских политиков. Завершаю. Хочу обратиться к нашим оппонентам, что называется, по вопросу о культуре речи. Прошу воздерживаться от ваших субъективных оценок и квалификаций действий. Спасибо. Наше продолжение комментария будет на сайте размещено.
I now give the floor to the High Commissioner for her concluding remarks. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Allow me first to thank all Member States and NGO representatives for the valuable comments and questions. There were questions about steps that can be taken to ensure accountability for human rights violations or abuses in Belarus. Appropriate measures of accountability follow from a clear understanding of the facts of the violations that have occurred and are continuing to take place. This Council stepped to mandate my office with the assistance of experts to examine the range of human rights violations at issue, provide guidance on access to justice and accountability as appropriate, and provide support for national, regional, and international efforts to promote accountability for human rights violations in Belarus is an important step in that direction. A range of accountability measures can be considered. I look forward through my own examination to contributing towards the Council's consideration of these key objectives. There was a question on the resources available to my office to operationalize the office examination. Unfortunately, only 50% of the required resources were approved in 2021. With the available resources, we have been able to recruit staff from the beginning of September and are currently completing the process. In spite of these constraints, the interim startup team composed of OHCHR staff that was appointed in April and was able to finalize all of the preparatory work, including initial collection and analysis of available information, as well as to deal with administrative issues, human resources, financial, logistical, and information technology setup work. The full requirement for 2022 will be requested as part of the HRC revised estimates report that will be prepared after this session and requested by the ACABQ and Fifth Committee. We hope to be able to rely on increased resources next year, and I expect the support of Member States to make this a reality. A question was asked on access to Belarus by international and regional mechanisms. Direct access is advantageous to any process examining human rights violation with, for example, ability to physically access detention facilities and other places where human rights violations have allegedly been committed, not being otherwise possible. But as the Council is aware, from numerous other situations, much can be achieved even without that, through flexible and creative use of remote tools. My office is well equipped, for example, to collect first-hand testimonies through remote secure channels, as well as interview victims and survivors in exile abroad. And much other relevant material is available and can be collected and analyzed without need to be physically present in the country. At the same time, an open and constructive dialogue can best be achieved on the ground, and I therefore hope that the government will revisit its stance and open doors for genuine dialogue. There were questions on support that the international community can give to my office and civil society. We are grateful for the continued support of Member States to my office in order to fulfill the mandate of the OHCHR examination on Belarus. In particular, we would welcome provision of any information that states may possess, which is relevant to the mandate this Council has set out, particularly in the absence for the time being of direct access to the country. As our staff will be working remotely to investigate human rights violations and to collect first-hand accounts from Belarusian victims and witnesses, we will be particularly grateful for the support of the neighboring states, which we will be visiting, in assisting with logistical support for the operation of our examination team. Civil society, both within and outside Belarus, has been central to amplifying the demands of the Belarusian people, advocating for their rights and maintain focus on violations and abuses of human rights that have been taking place. Their work has been extremely courageous and at times undertaken at great personal risk. I wish to acknowledge very clearly their ongoing commitment to the values of human rights in such difficult circumstances, and for our part we will continue to remain alert to any cases of reprisal for cooperation with the UN. I also encourage states and international and regional organizations to continue to provide appropriate support, both institutionally and individually, to actors defending the rights of Belarusians, and to do so in ways that take full account of the risks they are subject to. It is vital that as much of this work as possible can be continued. Providing safety with legal status for human rights defenders at risk, especially women human rights defenders, as well as media workers and victims and witnesses of human rights violations in Belarus, is also an important step which supports the work of our examination. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Madam High Commissioner. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her participation. We will now take a short break before the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the interactive dialogue on the report of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, pursuant to Council Resolution 42/25. And it is my pleasure to welcome the members of the Fact-Finding Mission, Ms. Marta Valinas, Ms. Francisco Cox-Vial, and Ms. Patricia Tapata Valdez, who is the newest member of the Fact-Finding Mission, having been appointed on the 1st of September 2021 after the present report has been finalized. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And now I invite Mr. Marta Valinas, Chair of the Fact-Finding Mission, to present the report. Madam, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Excelencias, distinguidas delegadas, distinguidos delegados, señoras y señores. La Misión Internacional Independiente de Determinación de los Hechos sobre la República Bolivariana de Venezuela tiene el honor de presentar a sus excelencias las conclusiones de las investigaciones que llevó a cabo durante el último año. La misión concluye ahora el primer año de su segundo mandato y seguirá cumpliendo este mandato hasta septiembre de 2022. Durante este último año, la misión ha investigado y analizado el papel del sistema de justicia venezolano en la investigación y persecución de opositores y opositoras al gobierno o de personas percibidas como tales. La misión ha realizado un análisis detallado de 183 casos en los cuales opositores y opositoras al gobierno fueron detenidas entre 2014 y agosto de 2021. La misión realizó 177 entrevistas con representantes legales de las víctimas y con exmiembros de órganos judiciales, incluyendo jueces, juezas y fiscales que trabajaron en el sistema de justicia en Venezuela durante el periodo cubierto por nuestro mandato. La misión también recibió 86 respuestas de jueces, juezas, fiscales y abogados y abogadas a una encuesta publicada en su página web. Además, la misión realizó una minuciosa revisión documental de miles de páginas de expedientes judiciales. Con base en las investigaciones realizadas, la misión tiene motivos razonables para creer que el sistema de justicia en Venezuela ha jugado un papel significativo en la represión estatal de opositores y opositoras al gobierno, en lugar de proporcionarles protección cuando fueron víctimas de violaciones de derechos humanos. La misión tiene motivos razonables para creer que, en los casos analizados, juezas, jueces y fiscales han fallado en su obligación de proteger a opositores y opositoras contra detenciones y arrestos arbitrarios y en ocasiones han contribuido a dichas detenciones arbitrarias, por ejemplo, dando sustento legal a detenciones y arrestos arbitrarios realizados sin orden judicial, justificados a menudo bajo la figura de la flagrancia en contra de lo que habría surgido de los hechos o solicitando y emitiendo órdenes de aprehensión a posteriori. Asimismo, en los casos analizados, la misión tiene motivos razonables para creer que se emitieron órdenes de prisión preventiva de manera rutinaria y no como una medida excepcional, sin ofrecer una justificación suficiente o adecuada. En ocasiones se dictaron órdenes de prisión preventiva en las instalaciones del SEBIN o de la DGCIM, a pesar de la existencia de alegaciones sobre actos de tortura cometidos o del serio riesgo de que dichos actos pudieran ser cometidos en dichas instalaciones. En 113 de los 183 casos de detenciones examinados por la misión, las personas detenidas o sus representantes denunciaron la comisión de tortura, violencia sexual y o otros tratos crueles, inhumanos o degradantes. En 67 de estos casos, las personas detenidas comparecieron ante los tribunales con claras marcas de maltrato o plantearon denuncias de dichos tratos durante las audiencias. En algunos casos, el análisis de los expedientes no indica que las autoridades judiciales hayan dado respuesta a estas denuncias. En otros casos, estas autoridades han ordenado al Ministerio Público que verificara las denuncias o realizara exámenes médicos. Sin embargo, a la vez ordenaron que las personas imputadas permanecieran en prisión preventiva en las mismas instalaciones en las que habían alegado haber sido sujetas a actos de tortura. Preocupa el hecho de que en algunos de los casos analizados, la misión tiene motivos razonables para creer que la Fiscalía utilizó información obtenida bajo tortura o coacción y que autoridades judiciales admitieron dicha información como prueba, sin cuestionar su origen, a pesar de que las víctimas y sus representantes habían realizado alegaciones al respecto. Los frecuentes retrasos procesales, más allá de los plazos establecidos por ley, documentados por la misión, han provocado la prolongación de la prisión preventiva y de otras medidas cautelares con efectos devastadores para la vida de las personas sospechosas, incluida su salud física y mental y la de sus familias. La misión también tiene motivos razonables para creer que en ciertos casos actores del sistema de justicia han privado a las personas detenidas de su derecho a una representación legal, negándose a autorizar la designación de una defensa privada e insistiendo en que sean representados por una defensa pública. Asimismo, se ha negado el acceso a documentos judiciales cruciales a quienes ejercían la representación legal. La misión ha documentado el modo en que la independencia del sistema de justicia venezolano se fue debilitando, un proceso que se ha acentuado en los últimos años, comprometiendo la capacidad de jueces y fiscales de ejecutar sus funciones sin injerencias. El nombramiento de jueces y fiscales provisionales, su disciplina y su destitución al margen de procesos formales han sido especialmente perjudiciales para la independencia del sistema de justicia. Exjueces, jueces y fiscales han reportado haber recibido instrucciones tanto de actores políticos como de sus propias jerarquías sobre cómo actuar o cómo decidir en los casos por fuera de los hechos del caso. Además, altos funcionarios públicos han hecho declaraciones sobre casos que involucraban a opositores y opositoras, incluso sobre su inocencia o culpabilidad. La información oficial es escasa, pero todos los indicios disponibles apuntan a que el número de procesos nacionales por delitos relacionados con violaciones de los derechos humanos es bajo y se limita a los partícipes de bajo rango. Recomendamos que las autoridades venezolanas implementen las medidas necesarias, conforme a lo formulado en nuestro informe de conclusiones detalladas, para garantizar que todos los actores del sistema de justicia actúen de forma independiente y en estricto cumplimiento de la ley, de modo a poner fin a las violaciones de derechos humanos documentadas, asegurar la rendición de cuentas y garantizar justicia para las víctimas. La misión reconoce algunas medidas recientes anunciadas por el Estado, incluido el decreto de 12 de mayo de 2021, en el cual se ha ordenado trasladar a los detenidos bajo custodia de la DGCIM y del SEBIN a los centros de detención del Ministerio de Servicios Penitenciarios. El 16 de septiembre de 2021, unas horas después de la publicación del informe que la misión hoy presenta ante este Consejo, el señor Fiscal General de Venezuela anunció la creación de una unidad especializada de investigaciones en materia de derechos humanos. Ese mismo día, la Asamblea Nacional adoptó medidas legislativas relacionadas con algunos de los temas tratados en el informe de la misión. La misión ha tomado nota de estas medidas y señala que se necesita más tiempo para evaluar la implementación real y concreta de estas medidas anunciadas. La misión lamenta que las autoridades venezolanas siguen negándose a responder a las solicitudes de información e intentos de comunicación y cooperación expresadas por la misión en 17 cartas enviadas a diferentes autoridades del Estado. A pesar de ello y de las dificultades a las cuales la misión se ha enfrentado debido a los retrasos en la contratación de su personal durante este último año, la misión se complace en haber sido capaz de realizar investigaciones a fondo y presentar hoy ante sus excelencias estas conclusiones. Esto ha sido posible por la dedicación y profesionalismo de su equipo y por la valentía de todas aquellas y aquellos que se dispusieron a proporcionarnos información. La misión recuerda el deber de las autoridades venezolanas de garantizar la seguridad y protección de cualquier persona que pueda haber colaborado con la misión y por su parte seguirá monitoreando cualquier tipo de represalia en su contra. La misión seguirá investigando casos de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, desapariciones forzadas, detenciones arbitrarias y torturas y otros tratos crueles, inhumanos y degradantes, incluyendo la violencia sexual y de género en Venezuela, con vistas a presentar su análisis y conclusiones al Consejo del próximo año. En este próximo año contamos también con la contribución de Patricia Tapatá, que fue nombrada miembro de nuestra misión el 1 de septiembre de 2021. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Thank you. And now, as it is the practice in our discussion, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. You have 5 minutes, and I understand that you may use some of your time now and the remainder at the end of the list of speakers. You have the floor.
Gracias. Rechazamos este nuevo informe que acaba de ser presentado sobre Venezuela y desconocemos una vez más, tanto de forma como de fondo, la legitimidad de la misión que lo ha elaborado. Al igual que en la 45 sesión, el informe presentado hoy adolece de una cantidad tal de falsedades e improperios que resulta imposible otorgarle el más mínimo viso de seriedad. No existe ningún rigor metodológico o científico en su elaboración, habiendo sido realizado a distancia por una suerte de misión fantasma constituida contra Venezuela y monitoreada por los gobiernos subordinados a Washington. Estos informes son muy bien financiados, con varios millones de dólares dispuestos para su elaboración, a pesar de la grave escasez de recursos que padecen las Naciones Unidas. Yo invito a los miembros de esa misión a demostrar coherencia ética donando estos recursos para la adquisición de vacunas contra el COVID-19 en vez de seguir prestándose para la ignominia de la calumnia. Estamos frente a un informe en extremo politizado, parcializado y selectivo, cuyas afirmaciones nuevamente se basan en el muy cuestionado estándar probatorio de motivos razonables para creer, con el cual se pretende justificar cualquier desatino sin verificación ni prueba alguna. Aunque se afirma que entrevistaron a cientos de personas, se recurre a fuentes anónimas e inventadas que nadie jamás podrá verificar. Apelan a las acusaciones de los enemigos de Venezuela, que son exhibidas como verdades absolutas en el informe, cubiertas bajo el manto de supuestas informaciones creíbles, el mismo modus operandi tradicional que se usa para instrumentalizar los derechos humanos. Estamos pues en presencia de otro informe elaborado con las técnicas del fake news y bajo la lógica de que poco importa lo que se afirme mientras se trate de graves y escandalosas acusaciones contra Venezuela. La única finalidad es continuar legitimando falsas realidades como supuestos informes de Naciones Unidas que luego son altamente mediatizados con fines políticos y partisanos para debilitar el progresivo Estado constitucional de los derechos humanos en mi país. Señor presidente, es conocida la obsesiva persecución contra Venezuela, sometida a continuos ataques multidimensionales que tienen su principal arma en la criminal imposición de medidas coercitivas unilaterales por parte del gobierno de Estados Unidos y sus socios de la Unión Europea. Hasta la fecha, se han impuesto más de 400 de estas ilegales medidas sin que la supuesta misión de verificación de hechos tome siquiera nota, desconociendo voluntariamente el notable impacto que suponen para el goce efectivo de los derechos humanos del pueblo venezolano. Las medidas coercitivas unilaterales contra Venezuela constituyen un crimen de lesa humanidad, conforme al Estatuto de Roma. Es un ataque generalizado y sistemático cometido contra nuestro pueblo que nos ha llevado a elevar el caso ante la Corte Penal Internacional y que hoy se encuentra en la segunda fase de su examen. El informe que hoy denunciamos pretende abordar el sistema de justicia venezolano, desconociendo ex profeso los recientes y notables avances legislativos en la materia, con la discusión y aprobación de 8 proyectos de ley para brindar más protección a las víctimas y testigos, el mejoramiento sustancial del acceso a la justicia, la reforma del proceso penal para una mayor participación de las víctimas y sus representantes. En suma, todo un gran esfuerzo para brindar una justicia más expedita que reduzca la impunidad y fortalezca la tutela judicial efectiva y las garantías constitucionales de la libertad personal. Señor presidente, la reprochable práctica de promover informes injerencistas contra los países del sur viola de manera flagrante el mandato confiado a este Consejo de promover y proteger los derechos humanos sobre la base del diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de su labor. Este Consejo debería reconocer y felicitar la fluida cooperación existente entre la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada y el gobierno venezolano a resultas de la Carta de Entendimiento renovada recientemente que está dando resultados positivos y concretos. Y por el contrario, no debería mantener este esperpento llamado Misión Internacional de Verificación de Hechos, ensamblada según los planes intervencionistas del gobierno estadounidense. A pesar de la campaña contra nuestra democracia y los boicots orquestados desde Washington y Bogotá, el próximo 21 de noviembre el pueblo venezolano reafirmará sus arraigados valores de civismo con la celebración de elecciones de gobernadores y alcaldes, dando una nueva elección democrática a quienes pretenden enlodar la dignidad de Venezuela y de sus legítimas autoridades. Asimismo, y tal como fue informado a la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas recientemente por el presidente constitucional Nicolás Maduro, mi gobierno seguirá avanzando en el diálogo fructífero establecido actualmente con la oposición venezolana en Ciudad de México, que confiamos
Sir, as
sea
you are
una
running out of time, may I kindly ask you to wind up your intervention? Thank you.
Incluidos los derechos económicos y sociales afectados por las ilegales medidas coercitivas unilaterales. Reiteramos nuestra voluntad de seguir cooperando con este Consejo y con la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada bajo los principios universales del respeto a la soberanía y a la no injerencia en los asuntos internos de los Estados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. As part of our interactive dialogue, I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the fact-finding mission and to make comments on its report. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union for a video statement.
The European Union thanks the fact-finding mission for the updates and the recent report on the justice system. Its findings are deeply worrying. There's reasonable ground to believe that most of the political cases are not investigated or prosecuted in accordance with national and international human rights law. It seems that numerous procedural irregularities have been carried out with the interference of high-level authorities in violation of the principle of independence of the judiciary. The report also points out the impunity for human rights violations. We call on Venezuela to restore the independence of the judicial system and to bring to justice those responsible for the human rights violations and crimes. We also urge the authorities to cooperate with all relevant international human rights and accountability mechanisms, including the FFM and the ICC, and to work on the opening of a fully fledged OHCHR country office in Venezuela. Let me highlight the importance of a political and democratic solution to the crisis in Venezuela, which leads to credible, inclusive and transparent regional, parliamentary and presidential elections and the restoration of democracy, rule of law and respect for human rights. With accountability and justice for victims being a priority for the EU, we continue to strongly support the mandate of the fact-finding mission. Thank you.
The next speaker is Germany with a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Germany aligns with the EU statement. In my own country, we hold separation of powers and judicial independence sacred, ensure defendants access to legal remedies and representation, as well as timely trial before an independent judge. Unfortunately, this system has been eroding in Venezuela for years. Members of the fact-finding mission, I would like to thank you for your detailed report. The case of Rafael Acosta shocked the world. Your assessment that no tangible investigative steps were taken by the authorities is deeply concerning. Hearing from you that judges and prosecutors at times are complicit, if not actively engaged in arbitrary detention and depriving detainees of their rights to legal representation, is very worrying. Members of the fact-finding mission, how do you assess the situation of political prisoners and the arbitrary arrest of 3 human rights defenders of the NGO Fundarides, including Javier Tarazona? Thank you.
The next speaker is Liechtenstein with a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Liechtenstein thanks the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for its report and for its indispensable work. We welcome the focus of the presented report on the Venezuelan justice system, including issues related to its independence, its role in investigating and prosecuting perceived and real opponents of the government, and its role in perpetuating impunity for human rights violations. We are concerned to hear about reasonable grounds to believe that judges and prosecutors in the cases examined have denied, as opposed to guaranteed, some rights to real or perceived government opponents, that cases before specialized terrorism courts were especially prevalent, and that the justice system fell short in protecting opponents from arbitrary arrest and detention. Upholding the standards of fair trial and ensuring the independence of the justice system without interference from the government is of utmost importance. Liechtenstein reiterates its call of the government of Venezuela to fully cooperate with the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the human rights situation, including by granting it immediate and unhindered access to the country, and to make meaningful and effective steps towards a system-wide approach to improve human rights situation in the country. I thank you.
And the next speaker is the Sovereign Order of Malta, by video statement.
Señora Presidenta, la Soberana Orden de Malta resalta el papel que desempeña la justicia y la rendición de cuentas en la prevención de las violaciones de los derechos y libertades fundamentales. En el contexto de la actual pandemia de COVID-19, las personas detenidas se encuentran en una situación de especial vulnerabilidad y es necesario adoptar medidas especiales para proteger y hacer efectivo su derecho a la salud. Las acciones dirigidas a prevenir la propagación de la enfermedad en el interior de los centros de detención son cruciales. Destacamos la importancia de proporcionar a las personas privadas de libertad un acceso rápido y sin obstáculos a la atención médica y a los suministros básicos. Por otra parte, la detención y el encarcelamiento deben limitarse al mínimo. Alentamos encarecidamente a que se siga avanzando en esta dirección. En términos más generales, la Orden de Malta sigue comprometida con la asistencia a las personas vulnerables en Venezuela, en colaboración con nuestras contrapartes locales. Malteser International está ayudando en hospitales de Maracaibo, garantizando el acceso a las consultas médicas, proporcionando apoyo nutricional a mujeres embarazadas o en periodo de lactancia materna y realizando pruebas de diagnóstico de desnutrición en los niños, entre otros programas. La cooperación internacional sigue siendo esencial para mejorar las condiciones de vida de los venezolanos y por esa razón pedimos más esfuerzos humanitarios en este sentido, en línea con las recomendaciones formuladas por la alta comisionada durante su última actualización. Gracias.
Je donne la parole à la France via Zoom.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs les membres de la mission d'établissement des faits. La France rappelle son soutien à votre mandat. La France est préoccupée par l'ampleur des violations des droits de l'homme que votre rapport met en lumière et condamne la persistance de violations graves et systématiques des droits de l'homme commises notamment contre les défenseurs des droits, des journalistes et des opposants politiques. Il est indispensable de garantir que les auteurs répondent pleinement de leurs actes et que justice soit rendue aux victimes. La France appelle les autorités vénézuéliennes à coopérer pleinement avec la Cour pénale internationale dans le respect du principe de complémentarité. La France appelle les autorités à mettre fin en particulier aux exécutions extrajudiciaires, aux détentions arbitraires et prolongées, aux disparitions forcées, à la torture et autres traitements inhumains, y compris les violences sexuelles et violences fondées sur le genre des personnes en détention. La France appelle également à la libération sans condition de l'ensemble des prisonniers politiques. Le Venezuela est non seulement tenu de respecter les engagements internationaux auxquels il a librement souscrit, mais se doit également de montrer l'exemple en tant que membre élu de ce Conseil, en s'engageant dans un dialogue franc et apaisé avec l'ensemble des composantes politiques du pays. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à l'orateur suivant, la Suisse, avec une déclaration préenregistrée.
Madame la Présidente, la Suisse remercie la mission pour la présentation de son rapport et appelle une nouvelle fois les autorités vénézuéliennes à la laisser accéder librement à son territoire. La Suisse salue la reprise des efforts de dialogue entre le gouvernement et l'opposition, ainsi que la libération de dizaines de personnes détenues arbitrairement au cours des 12 derniers mois et la diminution du nombre de morts en lien avec des opérations de maintien de l'ordre. Ces améliorations ne doivent pas faire oublier que la situation des droits de l'homme au Venezuela reste alarmante. Les allégations de torture et de mauvais traitements demeurent nombreuses et donnent trop rarement suite à des enquêtes indépendantes. La Suisse est aussi gravement préoccupée par les menaces régulières à l'encontre de membres de l'opposition politique et de la société civile, dont des défenseuses et défenseurs des droits de l'homme. Elle s'inquiète en outre des nouvelles mesures administratives qui placent le travail des ONG sous une suspicion générale. Madame, Monsieur, les membres de la mission, un certain espoir existe que la reprise des négociations entre le gouvernement et l'opposition et les élections régionales et locales de novembre puissent contribuer à améliorer le contexte politique dans le pays. Quelle est votre évaluation de ces développements et dans quelles mesures pensez-vous qu'ils puissent avoir un impact positif sur le respect des droits de l'homme au Venezuela? Je vous remercie.
The next speaker is Spain with a video statement.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. España se alinea con la declaración de la Unión Europea
le agradece la presentación del informe, pero expresa preocupación por sus hallazgos y desearía preguntar a la misión lo siguiente. En primer lugar, el informe refleja irregularidades y violaciones de los derechos humanos en el sistema de justicia, incluyendo injerencias externas en la labor de jueces, juezas y fiscales, detenciones arbitrarias, desatención de la obligación de proteger a opositores y opositoras y privación del derecho a representación legal. España desea conocer la valoración de la misión sobre cómo influyen estas dinámicas en la participación política en Venezuela. En segundo lugar, la misión afirma que los casos que estudia incluyen cada vez más a individuos u organizaciones que abordan problemas de derechos humanos, sociales y económicos. En este sentido, España desea conocer si esos casos afectan a actores humanitarios, dada la importancia que nuestro país otorga a los actores humanitarios para que puedan desempeñar su labor sin restricciones. España desea concluir dando la bienvenida al proceso negociador en curso y reiterando su convicción de que la única salida a la crisis multidimensional de Venezuela pasa por una negociación inclusiva, liderada por los venezolanos y apoyada por la comunidad internacional, que conduzca a la celebración de elecciones con plenas garantías democráticas que contribuyan a la reinstitucionalización de Venezuela. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador on Zoom. Ecuador has the floor on Zoom.
Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente. Mi delegación agradece a la Misión Internacional de Determinación de los Derechos de Venezuela por su informe. Para el Ecuador sigue constituyendo motivo de especial preocupación el recuento que hace la referida misión de innumerables violaciones a los derechos humanos en Venezuela, en particular ejecuciones extrajudiciales, desapariciones forzadas y tortura, así como prácticas de represión selectiva, persecución por motivos políticos y detención arbitraria contra los opositores al régimen. Igualmente expresa su preocupación por los hallazgos de la misión sobre el sistema de justicia en Venezuela, entre otros los recurrentes violaciones al debido proceso y la perpetuación de impunidad en los casos de violaciones de los derechos humanos. Coincidimos en que un sistema de justicia independiente e imparcial es esencial para mantener el Estado de Derecho y asegurar la protección de los derechos humanos. Ecuador apoya la demanda de la comunidad internacional para que Venezuela desarrolle investigaciones exhaustivas, imparciales y transparentes sobre las violaciones de los derechos humanos en ese país, adopte medidas tangibles y concretas para combatir la impunidad y asegure la rendición de cuentas de los responsables y la reparación de las víctimas. Finalmente, mi delegación considera que este Consejo debe seguir prestando atención a la situación de los derechos humanos de uno de sus miembros y lamenta la falta de cooperación con la misión y otros mecanismos internacionales y regionales de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au représentant de Luxembourg pour une déclaration préenregistrée.
Le Luxembourg s'associe pleinement à la déclaration présentée par l'Union européenne. Ma délégation remercie la mission internationale indépendante pour son rapport et salue l'important travail qu'elle effectue. Le Luxembourg reste profondément préoccupé par la situation des droits humains au Venezuela et les atteintes récentes à l'état de droit documentées dans le rapport, notamment des répressions envers les journalistes, les représentants de la société civile et les défenseuses et défenseurs des droits humains, y compris par des intimidations et incriminations, des détentions arbitraires et des disparitions forcées. L'érosion continue et intentionnelle de l'espace civique et de la liberté d'expression continue de constituer une politique inacceptable mais activement poursuivie par les autorités. En particulier, nous souhaitons faire part de notre inquiétude face au manque d'indépendance du système judiciaire, dont le contrôle gouvernemental a des effets néfastes sur l'entièreté de la société ainsi que sur l'efficacité et la crédibilité des institutions. Le Luxembourg réitère son appel aux autorités vénézuéliennes à coopérer pleinement avec les mécanismes internationaux de protection des droits humains et notamment avec la mission d'établissement des faits établis par ce Conseil. Dans ce contexte, il est crucial que la mission internationale indépendante profite de tout accès dont elle a besoin pour effectuer son travail en vue de l'établissement des faits et de la vérité. Je vous remercie.
The next speaker is the representative of Cuba on video statement.
Presidenta, rechazamos este diálogo, fruto de una resolución injerencista y políticamente motivada. Ratificamos nuestra invariable solidaridad con Venezuela. Es muy preocupante que la cuenta de Twitter del Consejo haya divulgado opiniones sesgadas sobre el informe de este mecanismo, cuando varios días después Ese informe aún no estaba disponible para los Estados miembros. No es primera vez que ocurre este tipo de irregularidades y valdría la pena conocer los motivos de la misma. Debe haber un tratamiento responsable y no politizado de las redes sociales. En diálogos interactivos anteriores con este mecanismo, expresamos que estaba destinado al fracaso la imposición de mandatos cómplices de las agresiones contra Venezuela, que buscan obstaculizar las relaciones de asistencia técnica y cooperación impulsadas por ese país con la oficina de la alta comisionada. Hoy lo reiteramos, es cada vez más evidente. Reconocemos los esfuerzos del gobierno bolivariano para hacer prevalecer el entendimiento y la paz. Condenamos las criminales medidas coercitivas contra Venezuela. Demandamos respeto al derecho a la autodeterminación y a la soberanía del pueblo venezolano y reiteramos nuestro firme repudio al empleo del Consejo con fines políticos. Muchas gracias.
And now I give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The DPRK delegation expressed its serious concern over the continued politically motivated pressure and biased approach against the sovereign states under the pretext of the human rights. It condemns any foreign interference in internal affairs of Venezuela with ulterior purposes of destabilizing the station and overthrowing the constitutional government. We reiterate our support to and solidarity with the Venezuelan government in its strenuous efforts to preserve peace and stability and guarantee legitimate and democratic institutions acting on the basis of respect for Constitution and national legislation and through dialogue and cooperation with all relevant stakeholders. Politically motivated pressure and a biased approach is counterproductive that undermine the dialogue and cooperation for the genuine promotion and protection of human rights. The HRC and OHCHR should strictly observe the fundamental principles of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity enshrined in the United Nations Charter, as well as the guiding principles in the work of the impartiality, objectivity, non-politicization, non-selectivity, cooperative dialogue, and cooperation. I thank you.
Thank you. The next statement is by Uruguay, by video statement.
Uruguay agradece a la Misión Internacional de Independiente de Determinación de los Hechos sobre la República Bolivariana de Venezuela por la presentación de su informe de fecha 16 de septiembre de 2021, que se añade al de la oficina en el curso de esta sesión. Expresamos nuestra preocupación por las múltiples y persistentes disfunciones y omisiones que el documento señala relativas a la injerencia en la independencia del sistema judicial y fiscal, formas de presión sobre jueces y fiscales, la participación de actores externos en la acción penal, actos y omisiones de jueces y fiscales y la ausencia de respuesta del sistema de justicia a las denuncias de violaciones de derechos humanos. Asimismo, constatamos que en el capítulo Conclusiones, párrafo 119, se indica que hay motivos razonables para creer que el sistema de justicia ha jugado un papel significativo en la represión estatal de opositores al gobierno, en lugar de proporcionar protección a las víctimas, lo que revela la falta de independencia del Poder Judicial, uno de los pilares que garantizan no solamente la existencia de un sistema democrático, sino también el respeto a los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
I now give the floor to the next speaker, Paraguay. You have the floor, madam.
Muchas gracias, vicepresidente. El Paraguay saluda atentamente a la presidenta de la misión y agradece el trabajo comprometido de los expertos en la elaboración del informe presentado, a pesar de que la investigación se vio afectada por los retrasos en la contratación de personal. Valoramos que a pesar de no contar con el apoyo del país concernido, la misión haya podido recabar información sobre patrones de ejecuciones extrajudiciales, desapariciones forzadas, detenciones arbitrarias y los actos continuos de tortura y tratos crueles, inhumanos y degradantes, incluida la violencia sexual y de género. El análisis de numerosos expedientes judiciales seguirán siendo fuentes de información y documentación. Expresamos también nuestra preocupación sobre las irregularidades en los procesos judiciales, la violación del sistema del derecho a la defensa, que pone de manifiesto la ausencia de independencia del sistema judicial y agravan aún más la situación de impunidad ante las violaciones de los derechos humanos. También tomamos nota de la observación de la misión respecto a que el Estado no ha adoptado medidas tangibles, concretas y progresivas para remediar las violaciones de los derechos humanos y combatir la impunidad. Recordamos que el Estado venezolano tiene la obligación de investigar y sancionar los delitos contra los derechos humanos cometidos por las autoridades. Lamentamos la ausencia de compromiso del país concernido con los mecanismos de este Consejo y tomamos nota que ante la ausencia de la resolución en ítem 4 de la agenda, no se ha presentado una resolución en ítem 2, demostrando la completa ausencia de cooperación genuina. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And the next speaker is the United States of America with a video statement.
We thank the fact-finding mission for its work documenting past and ongoing human rights violations and abuses in Venezuela and contributing to efforts to ensure accountability for those responsible. The human rights situation in Venezuela continues to deteriorate. From September 2020 to March 2021, OHCHR documented at least 66 cases of intimidation, harassment, and criminalization of journalists, media outlets, human rights defenders, humanitarian workers, union leaders, and members or supporters of the opposition and their relatives. The United States reiterates calls for the full release of all those arbitrarily detained and for the intimidation of human rights defenders and civil society members to cease. We believe that the best solution to the crisis is a peaceful, Venezuelan-led, comprehensive negotiations process that leads to free and fair local, parliamentary, and presidential elections, and a restoration of Venezuela's institutions and rule of law. How can states support accountability for attacks against NGO workers, human rights defenders, and journalists?
The next speaker is the Russian Federation with a video statement.
Госпожа председатель, в очередной раз вынуждены указать, что рассмотрение венесуэльского сюжета в СПЧ носит однобокий, политизированный характер и не способствует улучшению ситуации с правами человека в стране. Венесуэла неоднократно подтверждала свою приверженность поощрению и защите прав человека. Тем не менее, готовность Каракаса сотрудничать с правозащитными механизмами ООН на основе объективности и беспристрастности продолжает игнорироваться. Отдельно обращаем внимание на то, что односторонние принудительные меры крайне негативно влияют на реализацию прав венесуэльцев, на гуманитарную ситуацию в стране, а также препятствуют эффективной борьбе властей с пандемией COVID-19. Убеждены, что проблемы, стоящие перед Венесуэлой, должны решаться в рамках национальной конституции и действующих нормативно-правовых актов, без деструктивного иностранного влияния и без участия не пользующейся поддержкой Каракаса международных мониторинговых механизмов. Благодарю за внимание.
I now give the floor to Brazil for a video statement.
Brasil le agradece a la misión. Deploramos que los detentores del poder sigan de manera incompatible con miembros de este Consejo sin cooperar con ella. Compartimos profunda preocupación con la falta de independencia de jueces y fiscales en Venezuela. Hace más de un año, la misión recomendaba considerar la necesidad de las víctimas de justicia oportuna. Su nuevo informe refuerza esa necesidad. Identifica los factores que transformaron el sistema de justicia en Venezuela en un instrumento más de represión. Parece muy difícil que las víctimas puedan encontrar la justicia que merecen en su propio país. Brasil manifiesta su expectativa de que las partes en el proceso de diálogo puedan avanzar en acuerdos ambiciosos sobre el respeto del Estado constitucional de derecho, en particular sobre el sistema de justicia, como se han propuesto hacer. No hay duda de que esas conversaciones son instrumentales para responder a la grave situación identificada por la misión. Alarma, además, la reducción significativa del equipo de apoyo de la misión. ¿Cómo el Consejo puede contribuir para una acción coherente de la ONU en el tema? Gracias.
The next speaker is China by video statement.
主席女士
中方坚持维护联合国宪章和国际关系基本准则，尊重伪人民自主决定的发展道路，支持伪在宪法框架内寻求政治解决方案，坚决反对外部势力干涉伪内政。人权不应当成为实现政治目的的工具。目前，新冠肺炎疫情仍在持续蔓延，美国的单边强制措施极大阻碍了伪人民获得疫苗、药品等医疗防疫物资，严重损害伪人民的福祉和基本人权。我们敦促美国尽快取消对伪的非法单边强制措施。委内瑞拉问题事实调查团在其报告中只字不提单边制裁措施对伪经济社会发展、疫情应对和人道主义援助造成的影响，采用未经证实的信息，缺乏公正客观，我们对此表示遗憾和反对。谢谢主席女士。
I now give the floor to the Czech Republic for a video statement.
The Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the fact-finding mission for the presentation of its report focusing on justice system in Venezuela. We remain very concerned about the human rights situation in the country. The reported erosion of the justice system's ability to protect human rights and prevent state-sponsored crimes is worrying. The report states clearly that there are reasonable grounds to believe that prosecutors and judges failed to protect opponents of the government from arbitrary arrest and often deprived detainees of their right to legal defense. We are alarmed by the conclusion that the state is not taking tangible steps to remedy violations and combat impunity. Instead of providing protection to victims, the justice system has played a significant role in states' repression of government opponents. We reiterate our call for the unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained. Holding free and fair presidential and parliamentary elections is the only way out of the current crisis. We therefore emphasize the need to ensure conditions for meaningful participation in public life, including dissenting voices. Given the numerous human rights challenges in Venezuela, we would like to ask members of the mission what are, in their view, the areas to prioritize. Thank you.
The next speaker is Portugal with a video statement. And may I please ask the technical staff to check channel 2. I understand that there is some confusion with the languages of interpretation. Portugal, please.
Madam President, Portugal aligns itself with a statement delivered by the European Union. Portugal welcomes the fact-finding mission report and thanks Ms. Marta Valinhas and her team for the extensive work carried out these last months and reiterates its support for the mission. We are deeply concerned with the dire human rights and humanitarian situation in Venezuela. As documented in the report, there are reasonable grounds to believe the erosion of the independence of the judicial system has impacted negatively on its effectiveness and fairness. The recurrent interference in legal proceedings and due process and the human rights violations outlined in the report are deeply worrying. We recall that judicial systems need to protect victims of human rights violations and abuses. Impunity has to be contested and victims redressed. Portugal, along with the EU, has consistently condemned these violations and will continue to do so, as upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms is crucial to ensure a lasting solution to this multidimensional crisis. We regret the lack of cooperation with the fact-finding mission and reiterate our call on Venezuela to collaborate with the mission and to urgently address its findings and recommendations. We also reiterate our appeal to Venezuela to continue collaborating with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. Moreover, we welcome the ongoing political negotiations, hoping that they will lead to a peaceful and democratic solution, notably by means of free, fair, and inclusive presidential, parliamentary, regional, and local elections. I thank you.
And now I give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic on Zoom.
السيد نائب الرئيس، تعارض سوريا الولايات الموجهة ضد بلدان محددة التي يتم إنشاؤها بقرارات غير توافقية ولا تحظى بموافقة الدولة المعنية. يخالف هذا النهج المبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية التي يجب أن تؤطر عمل هذا المجلس، ويقوض فرص التعاون والحوار حول مسائل حقوق الإنسان. وقد أثبت هذا النهج فشله في المساهمة بتحسين أوضاع حقوق الإنسان، وأنه أداة لتحقيق الغايات السياسية للدول التي تدعم إنشاء الولاية. ويقدم النقاش حول فنزويلا المستند إلى القرار 20/45 الذي تم اعتماده بالتصويت مثالا واضحا لهذا النهج المسيس والانتقائي. تجدد سوريا رفضها للتدخلات الخارجية في الشؤون الداخلية لفنزويلا، وتطالب بالرفع الفوري للتدابير الانفرادية القسرية التي تترك آثاراً عميقة على حقوق الإنسان للشعب الفنزويلي، لا سيما في ظل جائحة كوفيد-19. ونرحب بالدعوات التي أطلقتها المفوض السامي بهذا الشأن. تدعو سوريا مكتب المفوض السامي لمواصلة الحوار مع الحكومة الفنزويلية ضمن أطر التعاون القائمة، وتجدد التأكيد على دور آلية المراجعة الدورية الشاملة في تناول أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في جميع الدول دون تمييز ومن خلال الحوار والتعاون. شكرا.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Georgia for a video statement.
Thank you, Chair. I also would like to thank the fact-finding mission for the updates on human rights situation in Venezuela. The report in question clearly demonstrates negative role of the judicial system in prosecuting political opponents of the regime. It is even more alarming that the control over the judges and prosecutors is achieved through harassment, threats, and intimidation, which is also imposed on their family members. My delegation shares the expressed concern over extrajudicial executions, killings, arbitrary detentions, acts of torture, and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and sexual and gender-based violence in the context of the government's response to protests, including those related to economic and social demands. We're also alarmed by the latest human rights violations inflicted by the state police and military service in Apure state. We also condemn ongoing prosecutions and harassment of journalists, public opinion and political leaders, as well as NGOs and humanitarian actors. My delegation welcomes the mission's further investigation related to the state and individual responsibility and victims' right to justice, with respect to violations and crimes documented in 2020 and 2021 reports, as well as in future reports. Georgia stands by the courageous Venezuelan people in their efforts to revive democracy through free and fair elections. Thank you.
And I give the floor to Chile for a video statement.
Presidenta, Chile agradece la presentación del informe de la Misión Internacional Independiente sobre la determinación de los hechos, el que actualiza la información sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Venezuela. Valoramos y reconocemos el trabajo de la misión y a pesar de las dificultades que han encontrado para cumplir con su tarea. Chile mantiene su preocupación por la situación de los derechos humanos en el terreno. Las violaciones a los derechos civiles y políticos de los ciudadanos persisten y la situación humanitaria es preocupante. Estas condiciones han significado para Chile y diversos países de nuestra región una masiva y continua llegada de inmigrantes venezolanos que buscan mejores condiciones de vida. Nuestro país sostiene que la solución a la crisis democrática y humanitaria que afecta a Venezuela debe provenir de los propios venezolanos a través de mecanismos pacíficos y negociados. En ese sentido, destacamos los acuerdos alcanzados en la reciente ronda de negociaciones efectuada en la Ciudad de México el 9 de septiembre pasado, los que, esperamos, permitan construir confianzas entre las partes. Antes de concluir, quisiéramos expresar nuestro reconocimiento al nombramiento de la señora Patricia Tapata Valdés, de Argentina, como nueva integrante de la Fact-Finding Mission. Estamos seguros que será un gran aporte para el trabajo de esa misión. Muchas gracias.
The next speaker is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland by video statement.
UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission's report once again highlights grave and persistent human rights violations, evidenced by rigorous documentation. Venezuela's security forces have largely avoided accountability for their crimes. Victims of state-sponsored violence continue to be denied justice. The unfortunate politicization of Venezuela's judiciary has directly contributed to an environment of impunity. The international community must continue to scrutinise the Maduro regime's efforts to shield perpetrators from accountability. We are deeply concerned by the recent needless death of Gabriel Medina, a political prisoner. Gabriel died because he did not receive the healthcare he requested and needed. He is the latest of 9 political prisoners who have died in custody since 2014. We call for the release of the 3 members of the Bundesregier's NGO who are still in detention. The regime's practice of regularly targeting individuals and organisations engaged in human rights work stands in the way of democracy and a resolution to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. We encourage Venezuela to give effect to previous recommendations made by the fact-finding mission and to fully cooperate with the mission. Madam High Commissioner, the Venezuelan regime has clearly not been taking its human rights obligations seriously in recent years. Do you see any signs that this may change in the near future?
And this was the last speaker we could accommodate at this meeting, which also brings us to the end of the meeting. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will reconvene at 3 p.m. to continue this interactive dialogue, followed by the oral update of the High Commissioner of Human Rights on the extent of civilian casualties in the Syrian Arab Republic and the general debate on item 4. Please note that the closed meeting in relation to the complaint procedure of the Human Rights Council will be held today at 5 p.m. Let me stress, 5 p.m. in person in room 20. I would also like to ask that only members of the Council take part in person in the meeting. I hereby close the 19th meeting of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council.